Hello, everybody, and welcome to another PNW Affliction narration. This episode of me narrating books is narrated in front of a live streaming audience. Nothing in these books should be taken as medical, dental, vision, or legal, or driving advice. And with that, let's go. This is book number 8, Summer and Winter. It is a fire and snow rural adventure. The legalese, no, this is book number 8. It's not book number 7, don't get confused. And the legalese, all rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without permission from the author except as permitted by U.S. copyright law. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. I write post-apocalypse stories, therefore portions of these stories are intended for mature audiences. There's about as much romance as you would expect in a typical post-apocalypse scenario. Explicit sexual acts where included are germane to the story and not intended to be gratuitous or fetishized. There isn't really any hard swearing worse than what you hear on cable. There's a moderate range of violence as would be expected in a post-apocalypse story, however, the suffering aspects are not deliberately glamorized or embellished upon. Please enjoy responsibly. Forward. Everyone thought bug-out plans were a joke, even if they didn't come around and say it. Everyone wanted a bug-out plan, they never practiced it. Then it wouldn't be good enough for a specific area. Nobody would step up and help finish it. Everyone else trying to work on it would be wrong, or it'd be incomplete and thus invalid, not worth trying. Then, if it was good enough, they'd take the plan and not include you anyway. That's the difference between theory and reality. There are the people that think something's better than nothing, and the others that will criticize everything until it meets the unobtainable goal of perfection. We didn't need perfection, we just needed something that would work enough to get us out, because there's no such thing as a perfect plan, and they never survive first contact anyway. Chapter 1, Classroom Storytime, 3 years after the collapse, late winter, early spring. I was teaching class again in our stronghold, which is my usual thing to do. I was really enjoying the teaching gig. We'd just got done doing some arts and crafts. Some of the kids wanted to nap, which I let them. It was snowing outside. The bitter winter we'd been guessing would come finally came. The passes were completely closed off for at least a few months. We had some plows, but they stopped doing it because it was too dangerous. The mountain range wasn't lava-y, which was good. The volcanoes all went back to being dormant and sort of just sat there, pouting as snow gathered on them. More snow and more snow. We'd had greenhouses, though, and everything was canned and jarred up, so we were quite prepared for this. We couldn't splurge on food, but at least nobody had to go hungry. With the fuel from the coast's oil rig and refinery, we were able to get enough tractors running to get everyone fed. Then when the electricity kicked back on, we could go back to pumping the natural gas to heat our homes as well. We had to take all kinds of special precautions to make sure our pipes didn't freeze now that the water was running again. That was quite the exercise. We completely winterized the main house. I'd done that before when I lived in this busted-up duplex for a few years. It would literally get colder inside than outside until I figured it out. The windows all had clear plastic sheets covering them, and all the seals had been redone, and all the foam insulation had been redone. Stuffed wash rags and vents that didn't have coverings. Thankfully, we were able to find all the materials sitting in an abandoned home improvement center. Apparently nobody cared about those items. This made the foam insulation plentiful. We grabbed as much as we could carry and then sent the rest to the hub for trade, so everyone else could seal up as well. The sailors helped a lot with warm clothes, which was very much appreciated, and many good trades were made. So the main building was nice and warm. The kids had some warm winter gear, but not a ton. They could only play out in the snow for about half an hour before they were ready to come in and thaw. There were 2 tremendous snow forts outside with accompanying trenches. The parents had all gone in on it also, and there had been many epic snow battles. A lot of the snow clothes had been made or modified by hand, where we couldn't get synthetic clothes for everyone. We insulated our winter wear with down from birds. Some of it we got ourselves, some of it was scavenged from pillows. The rest we traded around for. The second challenge was getting it all waterproofed. We used wax until the sailors were able to get us whale fat and taught us how to process bears for a similar method. The third challenge was keeping the wind off. To avoid that, the guys were going to be patrolling and holding defensive positions or hunting all got the best suits. We either had them milsurp or ECW gear Milsurp ECW gear, or we matched the system with what we could find. It was basically a breathable layer, then progressively heavier layers until a wind jacket or poncho if it was raining. The kids got smaller stuff so they could play, get exercise, and most importantly, socialize. We kept the kids coming indoors often to make sure they would keep dried out and didn't get frostbite or burn from the snow. Unfortunately, the snow would burn every part of the little kids that weren't covered up, so we had to be careful. We also had sunglasses for them all. It was quite fun and kept their eyes safe from the glare and projectiles. So here we were, all sitting, their clothes drying out. A few of them passed out from play exhaustion. Some light snacks getting handed out. Looked like cups of cereal, and they wanted to hear a story, about something that was both warm and cold. Kid logic made no sense whatsoever, but that's why it was always so much fun to talk to them. With everyone relaxing, I started. The story of Doug, 6 months before collapse, summer. Reality is that planning for a bug out unintuitively isn't a destination, it's a journey. Bug out plans are just like everything else, they take lots of steps. Also, you never put the bug out plan on one person or even have a single plan. You also need to have a bump plan in case you pick up extra people and extra gear. Bug out plans aren't a fantasy, they aren't a matter of if, but a matter of when. As the Pacific Northwest burned and the winds blew the wrong direction, anyone who was stuck there all of a sudden became a number. All of a sudden you're a 1 or a 2 or maybe a 3. That means either be ready, get set, or go. There's no number 4. House-to-house communications is done at that point. Emergency services are pulling out, so what are you supposed to do when nobody will be able to save your house anymore? You have to have a bug out bag for every single person and an animal that you're taking. It means having a plan and a backup plan. It means knowing where your family is. It means when you're running away from a fire, don't drop your baby. Don't get stuck in gridlock on a freeway. Things like that. A lot of people realized that when they weren't running from civil unrest, they were running from a pissed off fire. When it wasn't a city fire, it was a forest fire. Fires can do things like seemingly teleport over rivers that they shouldn't be able to, burn only tops of trees or burn only the bottoms, or skip trees entirely and only destroy houses in the town. A fire that might have already burned up their perfect bug out location, a fire that might be blocking the road to their rally point with friends. At the end of the day, what really mattered was comms. If you didn't know what number you were, or what number your friends were, or whose side that roadblock crew up there is, what were you supposed to do? Some people had to evac, some didn't. Intel was spotty. Fire was moving too fast, and the wrong direction got you surrounded with no way out. Equipment that was supposed to be there was suddenly gone. Sometimes a spot would be cleared only for fires to suddenly start back up again. People starting fires would get arrested only to be let out with no repercussions and reoffend. Laws had no teeth for the protected class, and they could start fires through the summer months with impunity, block roads with impunity for months on end. But conservatives trying to save their town from looters? Checking ID, making sure people actually live in the town that's on an evac plan? Lock those patriots up and throw away the key. Property doesn't matter, only feelings. I remember a big intention was what to take. Maybe you had a loose plan of where to go, like heading away from the fire then cutting across. But did you even know what you were going to be taking with you? A lot of the things that people wanted to take should have already been where they were going to go. Ammo weighs a ton. Water weighs a ton. People wanted to take 8 different photo albums that they never even looked at. If those were so important, how come they never made a compact copy that could go with them everywhere? Then everyone wanted to bring deeds and passports and social security cards and on and on. Their house was likely going to cease to exist along with all the property around them. They didn't truly own the property anyway. And they think if their country falls apart, they're just going to fly somewhere, as if anyone would take them in. What a joke. These same geniuses didn't even keep their vehicles fueled up. They didn't keep any cash on hand, as briefly useful as it was. ATM machines ran out without an hour per of getting swarmed by panicked, unprepared people. The prices for everything was through the roof. Fuel was a fortune per gallon, if any existed at all. Water cost several dollars for a bottle that would last one person an hour at most. Food was non-existent. All communications were down. The situation had no control. The catalyst was different, but the two axioms persisted. Predator and prey. Chapter 2. Doug. To base camp. Pre-dawn. Day 1. On the road to the rally location, passing by desperate evacuees with nothing but their clothes on their backs and whatever they could throw in their suitcases. Doug didn't care who started the fire or who was going to finish it. He heard it was some punks lighting fireworks and throwing them into ravines full of tender, dry trees. This had been at least the third such fire of this style in the last few days, probably stupid copycat kids. There had been several others that were cigarette butt related, but those were easily extinguished. Several more looked like various Molotovs and glass bottles with water for the sun to amplify through. This situation was more difficult, though. Mountains everywhere. Someone way above Doug's pay grade had decided weeks ago to not use the big tankers to drop retardant. Whether to save face or due to sheer stubbornness, there was basically zero air support. Some garbage about how the mountains, blah, 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 blah. It didn't matter now. Any good that could have been done has been long since past. It was all damage control now. Law enforcement was working overtime from 3 counties in every direction, trying to notify hundreds of thousands of square miles worth of people that they were under evac orders. And here was Doug, on the road to half a state on fire among several half states on fire. He'd been here once before, years ago. Chapter 3, Doug, Search and Conflict, 1 year prior. Doug had been seeing some old friends. Someone had taken his friend's dog, and nobody'd seen each other in a while, so everyone came to help look for the dog. Dogs are like family to a lot of people. When someone takes your dog and you don't know what happens, it's complete and total torture for years. There'd been a long string of dog thefts in the area over the years, and Doug wanted his friend to know that they had exhausted every resource. The dog was chipped, and they'd already checked every kennel. There was posters up on every street, and all the neighbors were talked to, and there turned out to be more dogs disappearing than just Doug's friend. Doug had got his map out at his friend's house and started pinpointing each of the areas. Doug was expected to know every piece of country extremely well, due to being a volunteer firefighter as well as search and rescue. He looked at the map and where everyone had talked about, and he was able to narrow the search pattern down to a small area. Doug and his friends had talked and asked law enforcement for help, but unfortunately, it wasn't as big of a priority at the moment. The story was that some girls had gone missing as well, which the public was more upset about, so that's where the law enforcement resources had gone. Doug and his friend went to the small town in the forest, which was only really a block of stores and then woods in every direction. They weren't looking for trouble, but wanted to know if they'd found the right place. Over dinner, at the only diner in town, a group of ornery guys came in and killed the mood. Doug and his friends sat quietly and tried to enjoy their food. Maybe these guys were a false flag, who knew? It was better to not jump to conclusions. Doug and his friend ate peacefully and quietly and listened to this new boisterous group. It was almost time for them to be getting back to their own town, and it was the end of the weekend. This meant that everyone was going to stop the search and head back to their own places, except for Doug, who could stay a few more days until his vacation was up. One of Doug's friends had an idea to go out and get the guy's license plates just in case. It wasn't too hard to find them. There was a truck outside with some dog kennels on the back. He tried discreetly to go get the plate number, but a second truck pulled up with a second group of guys. Doug threw some money at the waitress and barely got to his friend in time before the 4 guys could demolish him. Doug's 2 other friends got there in time to equal the odds, but moments later the second group came out as well. They all seemed to be friends or relatives or something. Doug's friend was doing his best stupid impression of asking if the truck was for sale, and the strategy wasn't working. There was about to be a horrible 8 versus 4 brutal fight until the bad guys noticed that Doug's shirt wasn't quite concealing his outside waistband holder with a double-stacked 9mm in it. Doug's friend noticed the recognition on their faces and looked down and pulled his shirt up over his piece also. It was a beast of a 1911 chambered in .45 ACP. Neither reached for their guns, but they were there regardless, a warning, more of a threat. One of the head crazies cleared his throat and said authoritatively, "What y'all doing out here?" Doug replied, "We're leaving." Another of the bad group responded, "Yes, you are, and don't come back now, you hear?" A few of them chuckled, eyeballing the group like meat, and then they all walked back inside. Doug and his 3 friends got back in their truck and left. The drive home was mostly quiet, with the adrenaline wearing off and everyone realizing how close they'd come to something horrible. Finally, Doug's friend who'd lost his dog spoke. "What are the odds those are the guys?" Nobody knew the answer. Finally, Doug spoke after giving everyone else a chance. "Give me the plate number and I'll run it through some software." The rest of the drive was silent, and they got back to Doug's friend's place. His name was Tim. Two of Doug's friends left to go back to their houses, and Tim went to sleep so he could go work the next day. Doug hoped this new set of details would allow Tim to relax a little bit. Instead, the opposite seemed to happen, and nervous energy kept him up for most of the night. Doug stayed up for a bit in the other room and ran the plate number through some expensive software that he had subscribed to a while ago. It helped him in search and rescue, and this was sort of like another type of search and rescue. After the submission, it would take a while to work, and Doug went to sleep, and the software went out to the internet overnight and chugged away to find the info. In the morning, when Doug got up, he found that Tim was already gone. To Doug's disappointment, his laptop was open to a web page with the address of an identity, some known acquaintances, and some prior convictions. He looked over Tim's computer, and it was chip-checked to the person's house. Doug quickly notified the sheriffs and had them do a health check on the address, hoping it would be in time to save Tim's life. Fast forward, and a bunch of girls' remains were found in sheds under paved porches, and stolen dogs were rescued, rehabilitated, and returned. Tim ended up being okay and reunited with his four-legged friend. The charges on some of the individuals stuck, but they only spent roughly a year in jail apiece. Dog fighting was unfortunately not a crime that stuck for long anymore, despite so many experts showing it was a gateway crime for even more grievous violence. It had turned out that the sons were responsible for the missing girls. They'd got off on light sentences, being under 18 years old, and were out on bond awaiting retrials as adults. Rumor was that more girls had already started going missing, but no dogs, though. Doug and his friends, having their big mission complete, drifted away after that. They always tried to get together at least once a year somewhere between Memorial Day and Labor Day. It helped them blow off steam and make sure they didn't drift apart too much. Chapter 4, Doug to the fire. Dawn, back to day 1. The sun was rising, and Doug realized it was just about time. He should otherwise be connecting up with his friends again. He wished he was here under better circumstances. He'd hoped to get a chance to see his friends. He'd sent them all text messages letting know he was in the area, but when he checked his cell signal, he saw there was no bars. Darn towers must be out, he thought to himself. Thankfully, his phone was plugged into the truck of the firefighters driving to the area, so it was at full battery. At least the message is sent, he thought to himself. Hopefully he'd be seeing his friends. Hopefully this fire thing would be a quickie, but based on the forecast, this was the most unusual fire he had ever seen. Doug was ready, though. He had everything in his pack that he needed. Rounding it all off was a folded FNC carbine model of a rifle. It wasn't very popular in the States, but was chambered in 5.56 and accepted all the common AR mags, which was pretty cool. The last time Doug was up here, it didn't go very well, so he wanted to be prepared. He had a weird feeling he was going to need his rifle, but if everything went fine, at least he'd have something to shoot with his friends. He reminded himself that needing always happened after the fact. He was trained to always be prepared, and that meant for the two-legged and the four-legged varieties. So he had his 3-day bag and a lot of ammo, and he was going to fight this fire. His group finally got to the site, and he dropped his gear off, along with the survival essentials, was his tent, his sleeping pad, and a sleeping bag. It was a micro sleeping bag that fit in a tiny bag. The bag compressed and inflated itself upon being unrolled. The tent was a little one-man pod that was just big enough for him and his pack. The admins would bring the fire gear in a little bit. Food was already on, and he set his gear down where it looked appropriate and went to go get some chow. Other portions of the crew were arriving in the fours and dropping their gear off as well. There were several other guys that had rifles also. Doug went to go back and get his so he didn't feel out of place. Normally, first responders packing firearms would be frowned upon, but the citizens had been doing more roadblocks lately, as looting had increased, and a firefighter's gear was their life. They had to stay protected. The best way for them to be protected now was for them to protect themselves. That's simply how it was. So they were all sitting down eating breakfast, and Doug didn't know any of these folks, so he decided to sit and eat and listen. They were talking about how the prior crew had got ambushed with significant portions of their gear stolen. Someone had even been shooting at them, but thankfully nobody was hit. Doug subtly looked around the camp as everyone was eating. He noticed a gal with a Galil rifle. He figured it was chambered in 7.62 by 51 based on the larger magazine and full-length barrel. It had a weird wiry barrel shroud he'd never seen before and an aggressive flash hider. She had dark hair, which was tied back tight in a ponytail. He continued to listen to the story and hypothesis and tried not to stare at the rifle. Everyone that didn't have a rifle by now was either getting one or press-checking their pistols to make sure they had a round in the chamber. As the story went, in 2 different other cases, entire vehicles were stolen. This left the fire crew stranded and needed an evac of their own. While unfortunate, it made sense to Doug. When there was no rule of law, the animals come out. It had been getting worse recently, almost like it had been some part of a new system. He'd heard of electrical line workers being attacked due to the perception of electrical being restored to subdivisions in the wrong order, but flat out attacking firefighters? He'd imagined things getting this bad, but now it was happening. Just another cog in the clock, he thought. Breakfast was good, tons of protein, tons of carbs. It was a gigantic omelet, and had an entire heaped pile of fried and seasoned potato cubes. They had a giant water tank on site, and Doug filled up the water compartment of his backpack with water. Doug had water purification in his bag also, but always started the day this way. His bag had enough water for the day, but in the heat and planning ahead, more was better. He had an empty canteen that hung off his pack that he used to help purify water. Everyone finished eating and their special fire clothes arrived. They all suited up and were pointed in a direction. They all hopped in vehicles, and on the way they went. They drove a ways and saw people evacuating the other direction. Some had animals, some didn't. Some had belongings, some didn't. They all had the same look on their face. They looked upset, scared, hopeless, and betrayed. The fire lines had already been created and failed. The first crew of firefighters had already been ran out. This was round 2. They passed some law enforcement guiding people out of the hazardous area. They heard chainsaws of a more relaxed crew trying to remove some of the underbrush from the side of a hill. A few miles later, Doug's team reached a substantial roadblock. Nobody without proper equipment was supposed to be able to get past this line, but these lines only had one direction. It was still possible for people to be past this line if they had decided to stick it out. However, the odds of running into militia folk trying to protect against looters got higher as well. Although law enforcement frowned upon people blocking roads in rural areas to protect their property, while allowing anarchists to block roads and attack property in the city. But hey, that was the new normal. Law enforcement recognized the work leader, saw that they had trucks of equipment, and let them through. It wasn't long after that where they could actually see flames and the wall of smoke ahead of them. They shouldn't be hearing any more work going on now. They were the front line. They checked their topographical maps and got their gear out of their truck and started working. It was a little weird working on a fire with a rifle slung over you, but it beat having to worry about being outgunned by bad guys. Doug had seen a police video online where a guy hiding in 5-foot-high brush was able to ambush, albeit unsuccessfully, 5 police officers and a canine unit. Whenever he thought to not bring his rifle, he remembered the officer's pleas for help. The words haunted and echoed in his head. "Someone get a rifle up here as soon as possible." Doug got his tools and marched off with his new friends, his unit, to go try to cut a new fire line. Chapter 5, Doug, Firefighting, Mid-Morning, Day 1. They physically got to the spot they needed to be, which was a several-mile hike out from where they'd parked. Then they spaced out about 10 feet each and started spacing out about a 10-foot patch of dirt. This was peaceful work for Doug, and he soon found his mind wandering. He would claw at the dirt with his tool and put out a piece of the fire with the dirt and keep going. Feet away, a pretty sizable fire was burning, but he ignored it. It was hot, but his assigned clothes kept most of the heat off him. When the wind would shift, he would get out of the way and let the smoke go by, then return to his spot. He realized to himself he never got to see the otherwise beautiful and peaceful place any other season of the year. He wondered what it would be like in the wintertime. Thoughts of imagining the area in different climates got him through the morning, and thankfully the wind never shifted enough to where the fire overtook them. Someone came through behind them periodically and got some water into the dirt for the crew to shuffle around. There was almost zero air support. Doug had recalled only seeing 1 or 2 helicopters dumping water from the nearby river. There was one of the larger, but not the biggest, planes that dumped some water from the river, but that was it. It made only a few runs after dumping an initial batch of retardant on the area. Doug was confused why this wasn't taking more of a priority, and then he suspected that it was because there were so many states on fire. He heard numbers as high as 35% of each state that actually had forest was on fire right now. He didn't mind, he had a job to do, and that was that. He was digging and shuffling dirt around and noticed everyone else taking a break. He went to sit next to them and have a snack. They usually didn't have full lunches. Everyone was asking the girl questions. She was about 6'3", and a prior police officer and prior military. She seemed to not want too much attention and started asking them all questions. Before long, the attention was off her, and they all shared their own stories. Doug didn't say much, just listened. The stories were all basically the same. Everyone loved the outdoors and supporting the community and helping people that needed it. This was the perfect place for that. They all finished their snacks and making sure they were hydrated, then went back to work. Chapter 6. Doug. Alone? Question mark? Afternoon, day 1. Part of the crew was ahead of Doug now. They were to a portion of the forest where some of the mid-level hanging woods and brush needed to be sawed down. They had chainsaws and tons of extra fuel back at the trucks. There'd be some sawing ahead in the process, and Doug would come and scatter the dirt around and make more of a trench. This gave Doug more time to think, and he wondered how the trucks were doing. It'd suck if we got back and the trucks were gone, he thought to himself. He tried to push the thought out of his mind, but he couldn't. At least nobody can successfully ambush us, he thought, and then shuffled back a little bit, feeling his rifle comfortably shift. That gave him enough of a mental balance to not worry as much, and went back to his trench digging. Off in the distance, Doug swore he heard another couple chainsaws. He yelled out, "We got another crew in the area?" He heard a calm back on his radio. "What's up?" He calmed in. "We got another crew in the area? I heard chainsaws." And there was a pause. Chainsaws shut off for a second to hear the radio chatter. Nobody else was supposed to be out there. There wasn't a reason for there to be more chainsaws. It meant there was another group out there that was unsanctioned. They could be good Samaritans that snuck past law enforcement somehow, but it was more likely that they were homesteaders of some variety. Equally likely there were identity politics aligned to unofficial firefighters out here that weren't helping, or that were helping for clout in their internal hierarchies. Didn't matter, they weren't a part of ICS and would get left behind as they weren't using the passport system. Such was life. Comms came back. "No other teams out here. We're it." "Copy," Doug said back. Everyone heard the chainsaws and shrugged and went back to work. If Doug could hear the chainsaws, that meant those people could hear the fire crews as well. Maybe even be on their radios, since they weren't encrypted. Doug didn't like that thought. Things felt so out of control here. Everyone was supposed to be evac'd out 2 days ago. It was much easier to fight fires when there wasn't so many random elements around. Having to deal with a fire and windage that couldn't make up its mind was challenge enough. Work resumed, and after many hours of troweling the dirt, it was time to start hiking back. The fire had pushed them back, but they kept digging. By the end of their shift, they had carved out several miles of fire line successfully. Chapter 7. Doug. Restless. Evening, day 1. They hiked back to the truck before it got dark. They had flashlights, but it was better this way to not risk as much injury and potentially getting lost. The chainsaws from whoever the other group was had stopped an hour or so early. Hopefully those people would stay put and not interfere at all. Unfortunately, law enforcement won't return to this area until the fire is restored. No chance of rain for days. 0% contained. It was going to be a while. They all had their GPSs out and followed their digital tracks back on the last known safe route, and before they knew it, they were back to where their vehicles had dropped them off. It was dark by the time they got back to camp. Everything was set up for the crew by some admins. Doug took off his fire clothes and let his inner layer of clothing air out. It felt amazing. He was just about out of water in his pack, but next to his tent, which was now set up for him, was a full gallon of fresh water. He set his equipment there and grabbed his water and went to the central area. There were chairs set up and a hot meal was finishing being cooked. The food smelled great. It smelled like some kind of steak and potatoes. Several kinds of onions and 4 different kinds of peppers, 3 different kinds of potatoes. Some of those ingredients Doug recognized from breakfast. They were in his giant omelet that he had. Dinner was somehow even better than breakfast. Everyone peacefully had dinner in the glow of the lanterns. There was no moon, and power was out for miles in every direction due to the disaster. It was quiet. Doug figured there wasn't much to say. Nobody was even BSing. Quiet the way he liked it. No stress, no drama, just them and the forest and the objective. With dinner complete, it was time to head to bed. He went to his tent, and all of his fire gear had been removed by the admins. It was starting to get chilly. Even though it was summer, they were somewhat high up, and the winds caused a chill. The fire was several miles away, and they were safe for the night, and Doug crawled in his bag and went to sleep. Overnight, Doug woke a few times to hear rustling around his tent. He couldn't tell if it was two-legged or four-legged. He laid there quiet and listened, his FNC in his sleeping bag with him. He had given some thought to setting up a camera outside and linking it to his phone, but he could never decide if it would bring him relief or creep him out more. Doug tried to extend his senses. The animals were quiet, probably because there weren't any. There weren't any, or they were just passing through. The fire crew helpers would have put all the food in bear bags or sealed and locked up in the vans. He listened for a bit and heard a few scratches on his tent. Those always sounded louder than whatever was actually making the noise, probably a mouse. There were some snacks in his bag, so it always attracted mice overnight. A few moments passed, and the scratching and the rustling stopped. Then it sounded like nails on wood. A pan lid got rustled, and then nothing. The moments passed as Doug got an image in his mind of what was going on, just in time for Death Shriek to involuntarily release from a mouse outside. The predator allowed the shriek for a second as a satisfactory reward to itself, and then a merciful crunch followed. The noise the predator made after that reverberated through the camp and sounded like a cross between a Tyrannosaurus Rex from the dinosaur movies and the hunter alien from the popular sci-fi movies about predatorial clans. That owl just let the entire area know who was in charge. A heavy swooping noise then occurred, and the rest of the night was quiet. Doug was able to sleep through the rest of the night. Chapter 8. Doug. Breakfast. Pre-dawn. Day 2. Doug was used to being up super early, so sleeping into 5 a.m. was a luxury. He'd felt like he overslept, but was still up significantly before anyone else. Breakfast had already been started by the crew staff, and there were fresh fire clothes by everyone's tent ready to go. They had breakfast, which today included mushrooms as well, and sausage and bacon. Another guy didn't eat sausage and bacon, so Doug got to eat his portion. He guessed that yesterday must be steak day, and today must be sausage and bacon day. There was some chatter about last night and the owl that paid them a visit. Doug didn't say anything and was wondering if anyone else had heard anything last night. Everyone said no. Doug chalked it up to his imagination. At night, in the silence, sounds are always really weird. At worst, he figured it could have been a deer. Nobody complained about any items missing, so it couldn't have been thieves. The firefighters finished eating, suited up, and by dawn, they were on their way to a new site. Chapter 9. Doug. Morning excitement. Morning day 2. Some planes and helicopters flew overhead as they had been eating breakfast, dropping red-colored retardants on the areas that they were headed to. It would hopefully provide a barrier that would make the environment safer for them to fight fires for the day. The drops were all expensive, though, and they needed to be dropped all over. The crew would be lucky to get 4 or 5 drops today. The wind had shifted, and a new area became priority. It was less remote, but the equipment had been sabotaged, and several pieces required to run the equipment were missing. Some pickup trucks that looked like a part of the fire crew went by their staging area but didn't identify themselves. Once again, the crew lead said no other crews were operating in the area. There was a new staff member with them today, a driver that would be staying with the trucks. He had a good radio and all their comm channels, and it was his job to watch over the equipment. They were further away from the base camp now, and extraction would take forever. The driver was a good guy and wanted to help, but had injuries that prevented safe cross-country mobility. Doug felt at ease, knowing someone was watching the trucks that they could radio at any time. Doug didn't feel at ease, feeling like they were being watched, and that they were nearby where the chainsaws were the day before. He looked around when he could as they walked to the day's worksite. He didn't see anything every time he looked, but couldn't help the feeling All at once, something tremendous was bulldozing through the forest towards the crew at impossible speeds. Everyone smartly froze and then started parting ways. Past Doug trampled through a giant black bear. The bear passed by almost close enough for Doug to touch, had there been a second to make that choice. Everyone else came out where they had jumped from and stared at Doug. He looked around like nothing happened. Seemingly oblivious to the situation, he shrugged at everyone like it wasn't a big deal. This made everyone a mixture of nervous and calm. "Come on, guys, we got work to do," he told everyone, trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. They all nodded and proceeded up the hill in their semi-line pattern. They worked throughout the day, and Doug noticed there was no longer a second group of chainsaw noises in the distance. The crew cut down the small trees in mid-level brush that cleared a sideways path down to dirt about 10 feet wide, and followed up with deeper grooves in the ground. Everyone seemed to be going normal. Everything seemed to be going normal. Then it was snack time. Chapter 10, Doug. Unusual day. Afternoon, day 2. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits and was even trading the occasional joke. Smoke passed through every few moments, which Doug could only seem to notice when he stopped moving. The wind had turned their direction, and ash was falling everywhere like snow. He felt his phone vibrate. He got a text message. He must be high enough to catch a tower somewhere that had power. His friends wanted to get together and was wondering when he could take a break, since he was sort of in town. He texted them back that hopefully he could sync up with them in a few days once he was done fighting the fire and the rain would hopefully start. Then told them about roughly where he was. He sent the message, and the bars had already died again, so it would sit in queue until it could send. He looked around as he heard some fidgeting, and it seemed like everyone was ready to get back to business. Everyone grabbed their gear and adjusted their helmets and assumed their positions on the dirt line they'd been making. The work went silently along, cleaving through the various plant litter and biological byproducts on the ground. Everyone shifted their way slowly around the mountain at a steady pace. The therapy continued throughout the afternoon, as the chainsaws, picks, and shovels did their work, as they have for hundreds of years. Not having big equipment was irritating, but supposedly there was backup parts coming tomorrow to get the bigger machines up and running. It would make this work easier, but Doug enjoyed the solitary nature of smaller hand equipment. Yes, carrying it all up a mountain, include multiple gallons of fuel for the chainsaws, was a pain, but the trip back always felt amazing. It was always about the journey, he thought. There seemed to be an uncomfortable feeling in the air that unsettled Doug as they curved their way around the hill. Doug recognized this feeling as right before something was about to go wrong. He turned a weird way to look at a spot where the negative space seemed out of place. A shot rang out, and a bullet missed his back by an inch, piercing the water bladder in his pack. He dove to the ground and yelled at everyone to take cover. Doug flung his rifle around, racked around, and opened fire in the direction he heard the fire coming from. Then Doug yelled, "Contact back!" as loud as he could. He wanted to let everyone know that the rounds were coming from him down the hill. Doug immediately wanted to gain fire superiority and give everyone else cover. Another shot flew over his head, and several shots towards the people to his left and right. He put rounds down the field where he guessed about they were coming from. Despite the fact that he couldn't see, the opposing force wasn't combat trained, or they would have had someone up the trail providing enfilade fire. They would have suffered heavy casualties that way. Doug was thankful there hadn't been more preparation and training into the enemy's plans. Doug emptied his mag as fast as he could, hoping someone else got into the fight soon. Within seconds, a thunderous round ripped down range from above and behind him, shredding everything in its path. There's the Galil, he thought, right on time. Doug reached behind him into his pack and got a fresh mag, refilling his rifle and stuffing his spent mag into his pocket. He racked another round and then yelled, "Moving, cover me!" He waited a few seconds and heard the gal yelling back down at him, "Move!" He heard her firing rate increase, and he sprinted further up the trail. He didn't hear any shots come after him, and in fact ended up hearing 2 more of his crew begin to return fire. Doug dived into a ditch that was being worked on by his fellow crew members. One of the crew was in the ditch, firing downhill into parts unknown. It was only a foot deep, but enough to provide some cover, as there was quite a bit of debris piled up behind it. Doug knew he only needed a few feet of dirt to protect him as long as the rounds being fired weren't too aggressive. The scenario started to work in Doug's head. There were 4 guys below them in good hiding spots. The crew that Doug was with was largely untrained. Out of the 20 guys, there were maybe only about 6 firing back. Unless they're extremely lucky, this was going to be an ugly trade. Doug's primary goal was the safety of his crew. The guy watching the vehicles chimed in. "What's going on up there? Are those gunshots?" Doug calmed in. "We're taking fire. I'm going to drive them away from your exit. You guys head back towards the direction of the vehicles." There was silence on the comms and more gunfire, with his side sending more than they were receiving. Thankfully, this unfortunately meant they would run out of ammunition, and he had no idea how much they took with them. He heard a gal's voice come over the comms. "Go for it. I'll cover you." He told the other guy with him in the ditch to make sure he runs up and around. Unfortunately, that was closer to the fire, but that was probably the plan of these psychos anyway. Press him up against the fire so they could take their stuff. Doug got a thumbs up back, and Doug nodded. Doug yelled, "Moving! Cover me!" He received a "move" back, and cover fire ripped down the hill. When the rounds started cracking off, Doug slapped his friend on the shoulder, and they both took off. His friend yelled, "Moving!" as well, and ran into the opposite direction of Doug and back up the hill. Doug knew better than to try to run and fire. All that happened is you ended up in the next spot empty. Sometimes it was necessary if you had to sprint a few yards and were alone, but thankfully he wasn't alone. Doug got behind a log after about 20 meters and calmed in. "Set! I'll cover! You guys get out!" "Copy, good luck," is what he heard back from the crew lead. He heard gunshots hitting random areas around him and popped his rifle off and squeezed off a few rounds down the hill. As assured as possible that he had suppressed them for a second, he popped his head up and started taking closer shots to where he thought the rounds were coming from. They all started shuffling around the hill close to the ground and were able to get out of the line of fire within a few minutes. The gal with the Galil must have worked her way up to a higher position somewhere, because he still heard her shooting every couple of seconds. Maybe she saw something that he didn't, not gave him time to reload. He calmed in one last time before they would be around the mountain and thus unable to get clear reception. "I'll swing back around the other side. See you guys back at camp. Don't wait up. Go, go, go." He shot a few more rounds blind over the berm and then popped his head for a split second. Popped his head down for a split second after he reloaded mags and popped his head up. Popped his head up for a split second after he reloaded his mags, then started shooting again. He was able to fire closer to where he thought they were and tried to gain a little fire superiority on a hunch. He heard more rounds come close and saw the flash, but no rounds connected. They must be firing blind, he thought. He stopped hearing the big 7.62x51 around and knew that the Galil had got out. That meant everyone else was out as well. He fired off a barrage of shots to make sure they recovered wherever they were. Firing from the enemy side stopped, and so he stopped and did a tactical reload, loading in a fresh mag. Probably his last mag if he was counting right. He had more ammo in his bag, but needed to refill his mags. Doug stuffed the half-full mag into his pouch so he could reload it later, use it as a last resort if he had to. He shuffled, holding the ground as tight as he could, and worked his way around the other direction, hoping to draw away the attackers. Incoming bullets started up again, getting closer and closer from directions, coming from more of an angle. They were trying to cut him off by circling around him clockwise. He wouldn't be able to suppress them anymore, and he needed to reload mags anyway. He took off his helmet and his bright coveralls and left them where he was hiding, and then shuffled away again. Hopefully he would be dirty enough and had enough earth tones to where he could begin to blend in. The trick worked, and the fire kept landing where he once had been. The shots coming from an angle, though, became more inflated, which put him at a greater risk. He needed to find a way to change angles. He crawled along and finally found a log that was pointing down the hill. It was a huge log, and he wouldn't be seen behind it. Doug followed the contours of the log down the hill for about 20 yards or so, looking for more micro-terrain, and then saw another log he could link up with. He crawled next to the outline of that log and managed to get another 20 yards away. Doug didn't dare steal a look in that direction of the bad guys. The movement and contrast in his face could surely alert them, he thought. He kept his face down and kept crawling, hoping to find another log he could leapfrog to. He finally got to where he could circle the mountain and hopefully link up with his friends, only to find out that the forest fire had cut him off. He looked back up the hill and saw the telltale red mist of the fire retardant was gone. The fire was getting closer and closer to Doug, having no fire retardant or fire break to slow it down. It was downhill, though, so it didn't advance quite as fast. It was hot, though, and he felt like the area could combust all around him. It was rare but possible. He treaded a fine line between the fire and logs, and eventually got himself out of the immediate area. They were in the mountains, and it always seemed to get darker here first, being in the shadows. Doug waited a few minutes to see if he heard anything. He did hear something, but it was maybe 60 yards away. Doug kept shuffling away quietly, trying to make sure he created distance and hopefully layers of ground cover between them. They would be higher than him now, and have a significant advantage if he was spotted. He quietly crept along the forest floor and eventually found a log he could squeeze under. He stayed there but couldn't hear anything. The shadows drew longer by the minute, and within 20 minutes or so, long shadows were cast through the area. Adrenaline waned as fatigue took over. Doug still couldn't hear well and realized it was because he still had his earplugs in. They all wore earplugs due to the constant running chainsaws. He carefully took the earplugs out as to not damage his eardrums, and he could hear a decent distance. A thought concerned him quickly about his radio potentially breaking static and giving his position away. He reached down slowly and carefully and turned his radio off. He wasn't sure if it'd be safe to have it back on. A second relief rushed over him. What if he dropped the radio shuffling around and the bad guys had got it? They'd be able to pretend they were him and ambush the crew. Or find the base camp, or who knows. As long as nobody was using the radios, they wouldn't be able to track anyone's frequency or location. Doug hoped the enemy systems weren't that technically advanced or have a dedicated radio operator. He was happy with the radio silence. They would be fine either way. Doug knew they hadn't been eavesdropped on via earlier radio communications because the attack would have been a lot more precise. He reminded himself that wars were often victories or colossal failures by the tiniest of margins, so he was happy this one worked out as much as in their favor as it did. The shadows grew longer and he heard some footsteps come within 20 yards. He imagined the guy above was looking past him far off in the distance. If Doug was discovered now, he'd be in a death trap. He lay there trying to will himself to slow down his heart, as if that would help, the shadows reaching longer and longer. The guy was so close that Doug could smell him. The wind had changed direction again, the odor was gagging, and Doug had to bury his face in the dirt to not begin to retch. It smelled like a carcass had been sitting in 100-degree heat with no way to breathe. Doug started to breathe through the dirt to try to filter out the smell and get his mind on something else. Finally, his breathing got back to normal and his heart calmed down. Just when he had almost relaxed, the guy seemingly above him faced away and yelled, "I can't see shit. Some bitch could be anywhere." All of Doug's muscles jumped from the sudden outburst. But if the guy heard anything, he didn't react on it. Doug thought for a second, then swore he recognized that voice, but kept his face literally buried in the dirt regardless. A face popped into his mind for a second, but faded back out before he could get a mental lock on it. Doug heard a yell farther back, "One of our guys is hurt, let's go back." Already missed our opportunity to get their trucks anyways. Baxter can't be far, he'll pay for this. Doug heard them walking away, but refused to breathe a sigh of relief. It was a cool reprieve down in the dirt, and Doug was finally starting to feel like he'd escaped the heat. Before he could appreciate the newly found comfort, an ember landed near his face. He didn't blow on it to put it out because the increased oxygen would actually give it more energy. He couldn't move because this was the pivotal point where he needed to be quiet. Left alone, hopefully the ember would burn itself out in the cooler temperature area. The contrast made the ember be so bright. Like, Doug had a sudden flashback to an anarchist riot. The anarchists had been throwing road flares into buildings. Not realizing or caring that there were people inside, someone inside the building had the bright idea to try to use a fire extinguisher to put a road flare out. Magnesium is considered a Class D fire and is insanely dangerous, burning extremely hot. You need a Class D fire extinguisher to put it out safely. A guy runs up with CO2, carbon dioxide fire extinguisher, and proceeds to prime it and try to hose down the road flare, beginning to cause a fire in the building. Doug tried to explain the risks to the guy and stop him from using the fire extinguisher, but the wannabe hero was having none of it. The guy's girlfriend went to pepper spray Doug, but she didn't know how to use it. He took it from her and sprayed her, then sprayed her idiotic boyfriend for good measure. Everyone in the building didn't realize Doug had saved them, then flocked to help the idiot, grasping at his face, screaming. Doug walked over to the road flare and grabbed the non-burning end and found a piece of granite floor tile on display and ground the burning flare in it. The fire suppression system kicked on, better late than never, as Doug left out the back through fire door that had activated due to the fire. As he left the alley, Doug dropped the extinguished road flare into a big empty steel dumpster. He heard it fall to the bottom and looked around, not seeing anyone. Nobody would be using that flare again, he confidently told himself, and then left that stupid city to its stupid anarchy, recalling borrowing one of the city's garbage trucks to escape. The memory faded and the ember in front of him burnt out, leaving a light char around the tiny fading speck. The ember, bright as the sun in the otherwise darkness, was now no more. The footsteps had faded away. Doug finally could breathe a sigh of relief. He knew his friends were safely back on their way back to the base camp. The winds had changed, so he was safe from the fire for the time being. Chapter 11. Doug. Dirt Nap. Night. Day 2. Doug stayed in his rut under his log and made himself comfortable. He wasn't budging until he actually knew they were gone. It was a full hour until he actually heard a vehicle far off in the distance pull away. He did the mental calculations and figured they had hiked in around 5 miles from the other direction. This was also conveniently as the contrast was turning from shadow to actual night. There was still basically no moon. As soon as the sun set, he felt the temperature drop almost 20 degrees, and a shiver rolled through him. With the last bit of natural light, he pulled out his map and looked at it. Doug held out his hand and looked at his compass and aligned it with the map. The compass auto-adjusted the offset, and Doug saw that there was a town about 10 miles away. Not really a town, more like a block of stores. "Oh, crap," Doug said to himself with the familiar realization, and said to himself sarcastically, "You've got to be joking." Doug put the map away and weighed his options. If he tried to make the hike tonight, it would be dangerous and slow going. He'd get there all right, but he'd be exhausted. Otherwise, he could sleep for a few hours, make the hike early in the morning, and be there by daybreak. It seemed like it made the most sense to him. Doug made a mental assessment of his condition. He was getting colder. He hadn't gone to the bathroom in a while, and it dawned on him. He hadn't had anything to drink in a while. Doug went to take a drink from his backpack straw, then realized there was no pressure. The weight was wrong. He realized he'd been shot right through the water portion of his pack. Doug wiggled around and could feel something metal in his water bladder. His water pack was damaged and the water contaminated. He had a few emergency water packs and his homemade MREs. He got one out and ate his hodgepodge of self-sealed meals. He drank all the water, and it wasn't enough to satiate him, but it had to do. He stuffed everything back in the bag and sealed it up in hopes it wouldn't attract any attention. Then Doug got his tarp out and laid it under him, and then got out his fire bag, meant to protect him from fires and worst-case scenarios, and he turned it inside out and covered himself up with one end, so he didn't cook. He instantly started to warm back up and gently fell asleep without realizing it. Sometime during the night, Doug barely registered something small and hairy crawling in with him and falling asleep. Chapter 12. Doug. New friend? Question mark? Pre-dawn, day 3. Doug's internal alarm clicked on and jolted him awake. Had he overslept? Where was he? He felt something move that wasn't him inside his makeshift sleeping bag. He checked his watch, his heat illuminating the timepiece just enough to see. It was around 3 a.m. The creature sleeping with Doug realized he was awake and got up and got in his face. In the weak backlight of Doug's watch, he saw the outline of a puppy's face. It was no ordinary puppy. Its nose was the wrong shape, too long. Doug did the mental calculations and figured he needed to get going to make the diner by daybreak in the nearby town. His crew would be looking for him, and that was the most logical place. The dog bonked Doug in the face with its nose to prompt him again. Warm nose, not good, Doug thought. It was sort of normal for animals to have a warm and dry noses in some circumstances, but puppies should have wet noses in this overnight climate. The dog was warm. It had been sleeping with Doug for at least a few hours. No mommy around. Probably displaced by the disaster, Doug figured. Doug rustled through his pack, which startled the puppy. Doug stopped and put his hand out, and the puppy came back, although it seemed to be limping and stumbling more than it should. They both paused inches from each other. The puppy finally resolved and put its head under Doug's hand. Doug cupped his hand over the puppy's head and gave the puppy's hair a good shuffle. This made the puppy happy. Trust was earned, hierarchy was established, everything was good. Doug began rustling through his pack again and found something they both could enjoy. They had some more of Doug's mix and match meals ready to eat. Then there was the issue with water. Doug was getting so thirsty. He drank almost all of what he had left, then put a dab of water on the puppy's nose. The puppy seemed to understand this and wagged its little tail as much as it could. So they both had a little to eat, and they both had a little water. It was time to head out. Doug packed up, and away they both went together. With the dab of water and the little bit of food, it made the puppy a bit more lively. It still favored one leg and appeared to be completely exhausted, however. There was no moon, and so Doug had to use his flashlight more than he wanted. He checked his map for reference and checked the compass on his watch every 5 to 10 minutes. Doug's GPS was on the fritz again, so he put it away. He didn't need it anyway. The puppy wasn't going to run around and patrol like a normal dog would. The puppy was following Doug as best as it could. It would lag behind a bit, and Doug would use the time to check his map. The duo walked like this for about an hour or so before all of a sudden the puppy darted off. Doug was used to dogs doing this and knew the dog could see in the dark at least a short distance and smell and could find him again if he wanted to. It was a wild animal after all and needed to find its own path in life. Doug kept going, and within 5 minutes had worked his way to a stream. This is where the puppy was. The puppy had half of its head in the water, drinking as ferociously as it could without falling in altogether due to its comically large head. Doug noticed that the dog was still so small, there was no way it could swim or even wade across this tiny stream. There was only one spot where it was even safe for the puppy to go, so that's where it was. "You've been here before, I see," Doug said to the puppy. The puppy perked an ear up but kept drinking. Apparently he had been waiting for someone to bring it to the water destination. Doug snapped his flashlight off but didn't immediately fill his canteen. He knew better. Doug instead got out his water purifier and modified it to pump clean water directly into his canteen. Always told were the urban legends of drinking water and only for a dead animal to be just around the bend upstream, so always purified the water. The puppy, almost top-heavy from its head being so big, kept a careful balance on the water's edge. It looked up at one moment at Doug, trying to inquire why Doug wasn't stuffing his face in the water as well. The dog looked at Doug as if to say, "Aren't you thirsty, big buddy?" Doug responded, "I can't somehow magically drink this water without issues like you can, little buddy." The puppy seemed to shrug like it was a first world problem or something, then went back to its balancing act of water consumption. He took out his filter, which had already been cleaned and pumped dry from prior use. Then he unfurled his collapsible bag and filled it with the untreated water. Doug took the bag and attached it to his filter, then squeezed all of the clean water into his canteen. He repeated this process a few times and then rested and drank nearly the entire canteen of fresh filtered mountain water. The filter removed bacteria and protozoa, but wouldn't remove chemicals, metals, and viruses. Doug wasn't too concerned, though, because he knew the stream wasn't down from a biohazard plant, and also the dog knew it was safe to drink. The most important thing was to get the bacteria as well as the Giardia. In that regard, that's what his filter did. Doug reached down into the stream with his collapsible water bag and filled up his canteen using the water filter and water from the stream again. Being done with the process, he put all the parts away. Before putting the filter itself away, though, he shook it out and made sure to get all the water out. Then he used the pump to back flush and dry the filter out completely. He didn't want to get water everywhere, and it couldn't be allowed to freeze someday. That is what would happen if the water was left in the filter and forgotten in the cold. Then he threw the components all back in their baggie with some oxygen absorbers and called it good. Satisfied that all of his water filter parts were put away, Doug set himself to the task of how to get across the river. He estimated it was several feet deep with a strong stream. Strong flow? Strong current. Possibly an extra foot deep somewhere in the middle. Up and down the stream Doug previewed, but couldn't find any fallen logs to potentially cross. Unfortunately, Doug had to cross, and he couldn't delay for very long. He decided to check upstream where he heard the water seemed to pick up speed. That meant the water was pushing past something. Doug went upstream and the puppy followed, also being done with its water time. Doug took a few winding turns as he went higher in elevation. A clearing was reached, and Doug could see the dull red glow in the night. It was in the distance, sitting there waiting for the wind to change directions again, trying to climb up the next hill that it had found. Doug wanted to make a face at it, then realized he didn't want to tempt fate. He shined his flashlight around and saw where the speed changed and the flow of water was coming from. There was a beaver dam that was clogging up an already tight spot in the river. The river normally seemed about 15 feet shoulder to shoulder. This choke point put it at about 8 feet. The dam seemed to be at about 12 feet. Doug looked down at the puppy, and the puppy looked up at him and gave him the facial expression of nope. Doug looked around and then looked back down, and the dog looked up and still noped. Doug talked to the dog. You have a decision to make. Either you trust me, or this is it. The dog seemed to have some thoughts go through its little puppy brain. Maybe its mom would come back. It didn't want to go too far. It never crossed the river before. The world was a lot bigger than it previously realized. If this guy wants to cross, maybe something else must be over there. Doug was looking at the puppy as the puppy went through its thought process and reached a conclusion. The little doggy tail wagged, and it let out a little but brave ah-woo. And then it went to the edge of the dam. Whoa there, Alpha. You didn't get this far to screw up and wash down that thing, did you? The dog, all misplaced confidence and no sense, took a running start at the dam before Doug could stop the action. As Doug was thinking, that isn't what I had in mind, it was too late, and there the puppy went. The puppy got about a third of the way until it realized that the logs were slippery and wet, and its little dog body and little dog legs were too tiny to vault across. Its little uncorded legs started fumbling as it began slipping into the dam. The puppy floundered and flailed and had the most surprised look on its face, slipping on the slick branches and logs. The fear turned to grief as the pup didn't know what to do. Doug, already in motion, was only one step behind. He picked the puppy up by the scruff of its neck as he expertly hopped along the dam before the puppy could slip away forever. Doug had run across the dam in a way to where he was vaulting forward on perpendicular supporting portions. Having spent so much time in the old rock riverbeds and having to get around wet timber, running across the dam with slip-resistant boots he was wearing provided a minor risk at best. When he landed at the other side of the river, Doug held the puppy up to his face, and the dog curled up limp. Are we a team, or what? Doug asked lovingly but firmly. The dog wagged his tail twice reluctantly, as if answering the question with a question. Doug cupped the puppy's bottom with his free hand and pulled the puppy up close with his other, loosening his grip on the scruff of the puppy's neck. Then he started ruffling and massaging the fur on the puppy's head. They shared warmth in the brisk morning and soon found a game trail. Doug needed to check his compass and the map and set the puppy down. The puppy scuttled off, probably because it wanted to download all the new information in the area. Probably also the market's territory, since it had got a bunch of new marking ammo from the stream. Or was it a girl dog? Did girl dogs mark their territory? Doug couldn't remember. Either way, off it went to do whatever dogs do. He checked the map and confirmed with his watch compass application that he was on the right track. Only a few miles to go and the game trail looked like it would take him right up the main drag. He put the map away and the glow of his watch shut off. It was still very dark, but he'd been able to see the outlines of everything forever since the beaver dam situation. This meant to him that the sun was starting to creep up. Doug finally had enough water to where he needed to mark some territory also, so he did that and finished, and he was ready to go about the same way as the new puppy. About the same time as the new puppy. He didn't hear the puppy for a second, and then it charged right up to where Doug was. "That's it," Doug said to the puppy, not sharply, but with finality. The puppy stopped and looked at Doug, concerned that it had screwed up again, but didn't know what it had done wrong. "Your name is going to be Charger." The dog pondered internally for a second and seemed to come to a decision and wagged its tail moderately. "Charger?" Doug tried to see again if the name was going to work. The dog bolted off into the woods in the wrong direction. "Okay," Doug said, realizing the name probably wasn't going to stick, then started walking in the correct direction. Doug got about 20 yards down the path before hearing the puppy version of charging. The commotion was more like a thrash and a scamper combined. Came back to where Doug was walking. Doug looked down and Charger had a bone. "Ah, crap," Doug said out loud without realizing it. "That looks like a human bone there, buddy." Charger wagged its tail. Set that down. We'll find you something else. How about that?" Doug looked down at it, and from what he could tell from his experience and from entry-level bone analysis, it didn't appear to be human at least, but it could have been. Charger gave a quite adamant response of "nope" by shaking its head from side to side, and that was that for the next mile or so. Thankfully, the bone got to be too much for Charger, and they found something lighter to carry. After a while, Doug stopped for a second and looked down at Charger, and Charger stopped and looked up at Doug. Doug said, "Which are you more of, a Charger or a Challenger?" Oh boy, that got the dog pumped. "Challenger?" Doug asked again to check and see. Oh yeah, the dog was going wild. "There we go then," Doug affirmed. With that, the duo made the last mile or so and hit the main stretch of the road by daybreak. It was deja vu. This was the same stupid towns those idiots were from. Chapter 13, Doug, the Diner, Revisited, Morning, Day 3. Doug and Challenger went down to the street to the town to get to the diner. No sense in not getting a real breakfast since it was available. In not getting a real breakfast. Doug's phone vibrated and realized the local cell tower must have power. He turned the corner onto the main stretch and saw that the town had electricity. Doug was about to check his phone when a pickup truck with fire equipment went past and stopped at the diner. He looked down at his phone messages and texted dispatch to let them know where he was. The message sent, and the other messages were from his friends. Doug didn't look at the messages right yet because he was still on the side of the road and needed to get somewhere safe. He went to the diner to have breakfast and see if those were people from his fire crew. He walked in and everyone looked up at him. Doug scanned the crowd looking for familiar crew members and saw none, only some dirtbags. So he went and sat at a table spot in a way he could see them in the entrance. He realized he hasn't sat in a real chair for several days. The puppy followed him and went under the table and curled up under his feet where nobody could see. Doug had some cash in his pocket, more than enough to cover breakfast. A lady came to greet him and asked if he wanted coffee or orange juice. "Water's fine," Doug kindly responded. "Actually, 2 waters. And an extra bowl?" He knew better beverage-wise. Stupid coffee, milk, and orange juice cost a frickin' fortune at these places. All he needed was water and his pup or two. Only water. She looked at him with a look of disdain that diner staff always have when you start out with only water and have stupid requests. Well, are you ready to order then? Doug responded, yes, miss. Can I please get 3 large blueberry pancakes with all the fixins, whipped cream, syrup, extra berries, you name it. He needed the calories and sugar in a bad way. She eyeballed him. Okay, she seemed to pause. I'll get that right up for you. It comes with hash browns and eggs, though. Doug responded thoughtfully. Sure, eggs, medium rare, no hash browns. Substitute with extra bacon and sausage if you can. She thought about it for a second, shrugged, and walked off. Doug nodded to her subconsciously as she walked off. He thought to himself again to verify the point of ever ordering a beverage other than water. You were lucky if it ever even got brought out to you right away. It disgusted him how even with job shortages, good help was impossible to find. Every employer inundated with dead weight, wondering why they weren't making more money when their service royally sucked. His thoughts were interrupted when she stopped in mid-exit to the kitchen and responded without turning around. Also, though, I have to tell you, no dogs allowed. She pointed to a sign Doug had walked right past, as he did with every other sign on doors. Doug completely disregarded her, then decided to respond in kind. It's a service animal. Emotional support dog, actually. I know my rights. Thank you for your concern for my dining experience. She glared at him and was about to go to the back before she tried to be smart one last time. Well, which is it? Is it a service dog or a therapy dog? She responded condescendingly as if she could trip him up. Scamming either system was a huge fine. Doug responded absentmindedly as if it was a routine question. Take your pick. They'll go through ADA. Now be a gem and let it go before I own this place with a discrimination lawsuit. She humped off into the back. Within a minute or so, there was a pitcher of water in a bowl. He poured some for his puppy and put it under the table. Happy lapping up of water commenced. Doug began sipping his water gingerly. He knew she wouldn't be in the mood to argue that he would need appropriate paperwork for the dog to be officially a service dog. Emotional support dogs could get paperwork if he wanted, but all he needed was a note from a decent enough doctor. Who cared if he had a dog in here anyway? It's not like anyone else was in here but those dirtbags eating in the corner and his canine companion. He'd take his puppy over scum humans any day. Challenger liked already being held in such high puppy regard, and Doug could hear his little tail quietly going under the table, the puppy leaning up against Doug's leg in its resting position to remind Doug that they were best buddies. Doug's concentration on his water was interrupted as his phone buzzed again. He looked down and dispatch said they were sending a crew and law enforcement as an escort to pick him up. He messaged them back with a thank you, then messaged his friends. They'd heard the news and were concerned. He gave them his location and that he was okay, and then he put his phone away. He took another sip from his water, and the 2 gentlemen from across came over to him. They were suspiciously wearing fire crew gear. Doug spoke before they could say anything. You 2 from the fire crew? They both nodded and slowly drawled, yeah. The man's speaking words were long and drawn out, very familiar sounding. Doug was starting to think they might also both have the same last name. It seemed like they wanted to say something, but Doug cut them off. Great. Which crew you with? Doug spontaneously asked before they could get a second word out. They both looked at Doug like he was an idiot and then looked at each other, clearly not having thought this through very well. What crew you with? Was the best they could come up with. Doug responded, Me? I'm just passing through. See? No truck outside. Doug pointed. Both of the idiots followed his finger looking outside into the parking lot. Doug quietly unholstered his sidearm and set it on the cushy but worn and cut-up bench he was sitting on. They both looked back onto Doug after a moment, stupider faces on them than they had before. One was about to say something, then stopped, his mouth clopping back closed again, trying to think of something to say. Doug imagined him about to say, Well, maybe you drove a car, then. That made Doug chuckle on accident, realizing they were in no way intelligent enough between them to come up with that. What's so funny, boy? He commanded in a drawl. Nothing. You 2 keep up the good work, huh? Doug tried to sound dismissive, but not unpolite, as if to say they were free to go and needed no further scrutiny. They both looked at each other. Their pride had been tapped. Both stood up a little taller with their stolen status showing no shame. The clearly stupider of the two, if that was possible, said, "Oh yeah, by the way, feller, no dogs in here in this establishment." Doug responded, "I checked with the staff, it's fine, thanks though." Then Doug gave them a double thumbs up. This annoyed them being treated that way, and they turned around and went back to finish their food. Moments later, Doug's giant stack of blueberry pancakes with all the fixins arrived. Doug, having remembered from last time how fast a situation can change, had a $20 bill waiting. As soon as she was within sight, he gave it to the gal immediately. After she set his food down, she started, "You don't need to." She hadn't done the math yet, but this was probably still twice as much as it needed to be. Plus, she didn't look like she had the heart to take money from him when there was about to be trouble again. Doug couldn't tell if she abhorred the violence to outsiders, or if this was so normal she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Doug cut her off, as she was obviously thinking this through too hard. "Please take it." Her hand was out for putting the food down still, as she was frozen in thought. Doug put the 20 in her hand before her brain could process. She eyeballed the 20 in her hand, more than the dirtbags ever put down. Then she started to recognize him from the historical events and mouthed something that looked like, "Oh, crap." She crumpled up the 20 in her hand, thought for a second, and scurried into the back. Doug wolfed down his blueberry pancakes without further issue. They were amazing. Real maple syrup, whipped cream, more berries on top. During bites, he would sneak a piece of sausage or bacon down under the table. The food would moderately gently get tugged out of his hand within seconds. Out of the corner of his eye, Doug could see the two pieces of trash eyeballing him with scorn and talking in a hushed voice to each other. Finally, Doug was taking the last bite as the Jackdard twins came over again. One spoke. "Hey, feller, we recognize you," more demanding drawl. "Nothing gets by you two detectives, huh?" Doug retorted, already knowing he was way past the point of no return. Maybe he could trigger them into making a mistake. Anything to curve the odds in his favor. The other spoke as if Doug hadn't said anything to finish the other's sentence. "And you ain't leaving so conveniently this time, neither." Doug spoke and swallowed hard. "Guys, you don't want to do this, believe that." Doug wasn't afraid for himself, he was afraid for what he would have to do. They appeared as if they were too stupid and confident. They both brandished sidearms like moronic cowboys in the movies. "You ain't got no choice this time. You're gonna pay for what you did to us and our boys." This time Doug was sure they meant their literal children and not the colloquial term. Doug responded, "Y'all got off easy. You served your time. Consider it square. Your debt repaid. Let it go." Doug feigned fiddling around with the last of the crumbs on his plate, giving them the opportunity to exit. They weren't having it. Doug barely had time to say "don't" before both of them reached for their sidearms. It was too late, and autopilot took over as the scene suddenly went into slow motion. Both of the scum were shot in the crotch from under the table before they were able to clear their holsters. The two fell down screaming, forgetting all about their guns and Doug. Having anticipated this, he turned around and looked behind him out the windows before getting up and leaving. As it happened, 3 more trucks pulled up. 20 guys aged about 18 to 35 all piled out and rushed in the diner. Every exit got blocked at once as the goons rallied around the 2 squealing bitches on the floor. Do something, one screamed. "He done shot my dick off," said the other. Doug felt the puppy tense up under him, not scared, trying to restrain itself from going berserk. The puppy knew, though, that Doug had this under control, somehow, someway. They all formed up around Doug's table like a weird virus about to absorb a healthy cell. The quasi-leader from before spoke somewhat calmly despite the situation, as if this has happened before. "Put the gun down, dude. There's no way you're getting out of this." Doug pondered his options and decided to draw the interaction out. "Your 2 cousins down there are going to bleed out. You going to do something about it?" Doug said cousins with extra condescension and disdain. The leader, or who looked like the leader, looked at Doug stupidly. Doug spoke. "Well, y'all do sure have the stupid look down. You jacktard's gonna take care of those 2 idiots or what?" They realized through his insults that he was right and started to take care of them despite it likely being futile. Doug doubted he actually shot them both directly in the crotch. He likely shattered their femurs, sending bone shards into their femoral arteries. The pain would not only be excruciating, but death was basically certain. Even if they could magically teleport to a hospital, they would both be screwed. 2 kneeled down to try to take care of them. That still left around 12. Doug couldn't get them all before they killed him, and he knew it. His rifle under the table leaned up against him on the other side. No way to get to it before he would be shredded to bits. Doug swallowed again. The lead psycho spoke. "Any last words before we take you down off to the pigs, boy?" Doug thought. "Oh, sure, just one little thing I've got to say. My friends are coming. The ones you and your idiot friends were shooting at last night. They're coming. You know who else is coming? The guy whose dog you stole, and he's bringing his friends. You take me away, they already know where all you live and all your back-asswards friends live." Doug choked the thought back and continued with calm spite in his voice. "People are coming for me, and what they're going to do to you is nothing like what your two cousins are going through right now, believe that." And Doug nodded in their direction as the last of their life painfully drained. Blood pooled everywhere, heavy exhales coming from the two bodies as they expired. "So, Mr. Head Nutjob, I only have one question for you. Are you ready to walk out of here and disappear, or do we have a problem?" In tandem, Doug's phone started buzzing across the table by itself. He glanced at it out of the corner of his eye as the bad guys all looked down at it once, trying to read it upside down. It said 2 words: "Get down." Triggered by the phone buzz, and the entire group of nutjobs started to draw, and Doug went down and sideways as fast as he could. He then slipped under the table as heavy bullets tore through the window into the sick bastards across the way. Doug rolled up into a ball with Challenger in the middle, and they sat out the hail of incoming gunfire. He heard the staff all hit the ground as well to wait out the barrage. A few of the pack broke off to the back. The move was anticipated, though, and people were waiting for them. They all got gunned down instantly. The other few that survived the first volley tried to get out of the front with guns up. They lasted less than 2 seconds. Doug reached up past the glass on the bench and grabbed his sidearm and holstered it and turned his comm on. "Coming out?" Hoping that they were still on the same channel as yesterday, they radioed him back. "Go ahead." He grabbed his rifle as well as his puppy so it wouldn't have to walk over glass, then came out. All of his friends and crew were there, and they all stood there just looking at him, including Galil and Tim. Doug felt like he had to say something. Well, this area may be temporarily without rule of law, but I think we all know justice was served this day." They all nodded, and they all got in their trucks, Doug holding his puppy as they drove off. They heard the crew chief over his horn. "This area is under level 3 evacuation. The fire is expected to be here within a half an hour. Grab your belongings and leave. This is your only warning." The fire crew and Doug's close friends all left. They led the way with the miniature town in vehicles behind them. Doug. Epilogue. Within 15 minutes, the town was consumed. None of the psychos made it out. Their houses were all burned to the ground in the same fire. All evidence of them ceased to exist, and nobody ever spoke of them again. Within a week, it rained for 5 straight days. The fire vanished as fast as it appeared, and Dunk had a new doggy friend, which, as it happens, turned out to be a boy. The wolf rescue named Challenger. Doug's story time continued. Days before collapse. Winter. In the last few months, storms had really gotten bad and the anarchy had got worse. It had been bad for years, but it was all finally coming together. The people that identify with Guy Fawkes and wear masks in his image had splintered up into 2 groups. Those who considered speech violence and those who believed in full transparency without exception. Storms had been smashing the East Coast one after another with barely a day's break between them. Some of them powerful enough to do 2 full rotations before dissipating. Where before they would hit the coast in random orders, they were now hitting the coast in nearly identical patterns in sets of 3 to 5. Infrastructure would be devastated and busted down to raw material, only to get hit a second time, scattering it everywhere. By the 3rd time, the area was unrecognizable as a modern human settlement, and by the 5th event, it was a challenge to tell that people ever lived there. Anarchy and storms are starting to go hand in hand, with violence and looting filling the void of law and infrastructure. What began as reparations, with the theft of shoes and televisions, soon escalated into a contest to destroy what was left of whichever storm ravaged town before anyone could return to fix it. The biggest natural disaster recovery team in the country was embezzling over 90% of the aid it was receiving. Private groups were barred from nearly all assistance on the mainland except to rescue animals with the Humane Society. The checkpoints were all single direction, and people weren't allowed to return to their plot of land for a month or longer. Food and fuel became increasingly more rare and expensive. If looters were caught by law enforcement, they got a minimum 10-year sentence. If homeowners caught them first, the looters became additional casualties in the storm. When National Guard was deployed, it wasn't in any security capacity, and participation quickly dwindled as people melted back into society to protect their immediate families. The displacements became more disruptive, and the miscommunication continued to get worse. The aid organizations themselves often had false or unactionable intel. The local residents were marred by outside influences spreading false information and data. Meanwhile, some communities were fine while others ceased to exist. Floods went for 1,000 miles up and down the coast, sparing some communities and turning others into new permanent tributaries. Where there had once been a path towards salvaging situation and rebuilding, the attempted recovery effort wouldn't stop tripping over its own feet. People had been surviving a long time before gigantic corporate-sized recovery operations. Eventually, people got tired of being turned away to help. They got tired of filling up local food banks only to have the product never arrive to the affected areas. People helped directly where they could, and then responsibility ended up on every unique subdivision that had any infrastructure left. As things got worse, there was no way to jail anyone anymore, let alone feed them. What were you going to do? Put looters in general population with displaced communities? They would tear the looters apart anyway. The looters were shot. The survivors were shot again. The sheriffs in every town declared open hostility on anyone coming in that had ill intent. It was a new kind of martial law, not the kind that everyone wanted, but the kind that the towns needed. Eventually, the Humane Society struck a deal with FEMA camps and Red Cross and let everyone keep their animals. The only stipulations were the critters had to be peaceful and quarantined briefly to ensure no communicable diseases. The West Coast was due for its own big natural disaster. Everyone thought it was going to be earthquakes, and there had been several big ones. Our neighbors to the south had gotten creamed by several in a row that left thousands without power and hundreds dead. The Pacific Northwest, though? Well, they only ever got tiny blips here and there. The West Coast wasn't going to get the dreaded earthquake to end all earthquakes. It was going to get some kind of giant storm, exactly like the East Coast was getting. It was going to be in the winter, and it was going to be cold. Chapter 14, Doug Prep. Night before collapse, pre-dawn, day 1. Wider Portlandia area. Doug was ready to go. It didn't take much. A proprietary alarm that he rarely heard from went off out of nowhere in the middle of the night. The powers that be requested a CERT team or a special emergency response team to head somewhere extremely cold. No details except that we'd get him on the way. He had to be to a helicopter in town within 20 minutes or his contract with the company would expire. The storm was going crazy where he was at. It was pounding the coast as rain, but mid-higher elevations as snow. Then it was dying out before it could accumulate on the mountains. It was a double-edged sword. There wouldn't be a huge drowning thaw in the spring, but everything prior to the mountains would be up higher than the cars in the snow for the good portion of a month. It was some kind of sleet rain mess right now that was clearing back up in the daytime and then coming back at night. The weird temperature shifts between night and day tended to have that effect. Thankfully, the messy mixture was still low enough to where Doug could get in his four-wheel drive and get on top of the frosty mixture and get to the rendezvous point. Destination was a parking garage where his vehicle would be safe and where the helicopter could land in the storm. He was almost ready when he got a big wet nose in the face. Challenger wanted to go play out in the snow. Doug understood. This dog was basically genetically designed to be out in cruddy weather. Doug had only within the last few days got Challenger back from training. He'd had his dog sent off to get a battery of rapid training courses for search and rescue as well as home defense and a couple of basic commands. It was a rush version of the training, and Challenger needed more time to be officially certified. The training was close enough to deploy as long as nobody looked too deep into the training's completion and validation. Doug hadn't even had a chance to do a full practice run at the park with Challenger. Wouldn't you know it, that some guy ran off with some gal's purse, and without 2 tourniquets would have lost more than his arm. The now armless guy wanted to press charges, but was so incoherent that the statement was mostly gibberish. Something about a dog coming out of nowhere and returning the person arm. The officer and his canine returned the arm with no suspects and no way to tell specific teeth marks from anything else. 2 otherwise unremarkable tourniquets, expertly applied on the stump by an apparent good Samaritan with dates and all, no cameras around quality enough to give a good identifier. The officer that responded was a canine officer, and so Challenger wouldn't stop flirting with the canine dog, so it ended up being okay. It got left out of the reports that it took multiple commands to get Challenger to release the mangled arm, and thankfully no videos surfaced, and the lady was happy to get her purse back, sans an extra arm. In haste, Doug forgot to pack the new command list for Challenger. Doug did, however, remember to get Challenger's tactical suit on. It was a vest with all sorts of pouches, including sleeves for canine-designed armor, plating, food, and collapsible water dish and various medicines. Challenger had acquired several wounds on him from exposure to the heat and elements, but had otherwise been okay after the forest rescue. As a result, he was fully healed up now. The medicines and first aid for his four-legged buddy were just in case. Challenger had a new collar. It was pretty cool. Basically, it let off a little vibration that Challenger could feel if he got too far away from Doug. Doug had the matching wristband that went with it. The wristband also had a little arrow that pointed to where Challenger was at any given time. Doug pressed a button to make sure it was working, and it was. Doug always had a 3-day pack ready, but this was an extra scenario, so he threw his winter system on the bed to make sure it went with. It was a 3-part system with a goose-down inner bag that could handle about to negative 20 degrees as the primary bag, then an outer removable bag that could handle down to negative 40 as the middle layer, and lastly a third bag outside, which was waterproof, stab-resistant, slash-resistant, and could breathe, usually to protect against sharp twigs and rocks. To top all that off, Doug had his cushy, insulated sleeping pad that inflated itself and his low-profile all-weather tent that was big enough for him and his bag. It was a new tent that he purchased special that had a spot for his new doggy. Rolled up with his sleeping pad was a special dog-sized sleeping pad so that Challenger didn't have to sleep on the cold ground. It wasn't good for her doggy bones, and helped to keep her warm. Even though she was a snow-type dog, they never really laid on the snow in the wild. They actually dug burrows to keep themselves warm, generally speaking, so basically these type of dogs needed help to keep in tip-top shape in sub-20 temperatures. Doug didn't think it'd be past negative 20, but it never hurt to prepare. Unfortunately, once you got past negative 20 and any sort of altitude and wind, everything changed. Fuel becomes a problem, starting fires becomes a challenge, and keeping your drinking water from freezing. It all turns into a royal pain in the butt. Wind chill starts to make the air feel exponentially colder the colder it gets and everything. There was nothing easy or safe about it. Doug thought about everything else to make sure he had everything. His watch told him he had to leave within a few minutes to get to the parking garage in time. He had 2 pairs of thermal inner layers that would keep him warm and dry and whisk sweat away. He had a middle layer to keep him warm and an outer layer that could break wind, and another layer on top of that for heavy downpours. He somehow got it all either crammed in his giant pack or rolled up on top of his pack, or he was wearing it on him. He had special boots for snow as well. They had an outer shell and an inner liner with cuffs at the top to keep feet dry. They could breathe and wouldn't get destroyed in sub-negative 40 either. With all of his main mission-specific items packed and all of his miscellaneous items already ready, he notified his pooch that he was coming as well as they headed out. To Challenger, this was absolutely no big deal, like it was something she was born for. Doug locked up and left the porch light on, and in the 4-wheel drive they went. Chapter 15, Doug, Winter Driving, Dawn, Day 1. Doug's 4-wheel drive had already been warming up in the driveway. It didn't have chains on and didn't really need them unless in the strictest of circumstances. He stomped over to the passenger side and let Challenger in after she went potty near what resembled a snow-shaped tree in the yard. All Doug had to do was hold the door open and pat on the seat for a second, and in barreled the dog. Doug shut the door carefully behind Challenger and stomped around to the other side and got in. Doug turned the station to the news and turned on the radio in his vehicle and turned on his comms in his vehicle in case anything needed to be radioed in or out. A lot of people had given up on cell phones at this point due to unreliability and disasters, or the fact that the government seemed to shut them off at will with no transparency. He had a special cell phone on an emergency band, but didn't need it besides verifying call-out info. Only people you could call with it when the towers got congested were other people with the same network and plan, which didn't do anyone any good. Doug put his truck in drive and patted his dog on the head, and slowly they went. Doug had preset the drive system to its 4-wheel setting, and it felt completely stable. There would be stop signs here and there, but there was an art to driving in the snow. You would let your foot off the gas and listen. If you didn't hear anything, you just kept coasting through. Stopping usually meant getting stuck. Hardly nobody was out on the roads. The early birds were already in the ditch, and everyone else was staying home. School was already canceled in this area as a knee-jerk reaction. For anyone who actually still went to school on site. Which didn't really matter either way. Doug considered helping every second or third person he passed in the ditch, but there was no time. They were all idiots for trying to maintain normalcy when literally everything around them was a sign that they needed to reevaluate the situation. Was their stupid dead-end job really that important? Did the boss really need his or her whatever at 8 a.m.? Of course not. They were all idiotic, unprepared sheep, and they were paying for it. But what was Doug doing? He thought about it for a minute. He was going to save people that needed help. What was the difference? Doug pondered some more. The difference was that people he was helping actually prepared for the eventuality and thus had pre-planned help on the way. All these people he passed in the ditch had no help and no preparation. Disaster planning was an afterthought to them, and now they were paying the minor inconvenience of a price. They wouldn't die, of course. State Patrol or the city or the police department or the sheriff's department had them on some list somewhere and was helping them out in the order the idiots got stuck. They probably had something to snack on. They probably had a kid's jacket or something they could throw over their nylon leggings, yoga pants, or khakis. They'd call their boss and say they got stuck, and that would automatically make their stupid deadline slip acceptable. Insurance would cover all the easily avoidable wrecked cars. Everyone's premiums would go up. Everyone would pat themselves on the back for trying and deflect responsibility. And then all of them would do it again tomorrow. Doug shook his head at the idiots and looked over at his puppy. Well, she wasn't a puppy anymore, that's for sure. She grew up quick, and she was turning into an absolute massive handful. Challenger looked back at him with her big doe eyes, like every day was the best day of her life. Doug reached over while looking at the road to pat her on the head. She instead devoured his hand. She didn't bite down, she just inhaled his hand. He didn't even bother trying to pull out, just shoved it in a little more and then gently pulled it out. He looked at her and she looked back at him like it was pretty funny. Doug gave her a funny look and tried again. She let him pet her this time after he wiped the slime off on her, which she seemed to like. "You're a weird dog," Doug said. She made some kind of rumbling noise that sort of sounded affectionate and then looked back out the window. She was making nose shapes and a breath fog on the window. She clearly wanted to go out and play, but thought this was acceptable for now. Doug was happy he was able to get the approval to bring her along. Usually dogs were nuisances at events unless they were highly controlled, but in search and rescue they were invaluable. All he had to do was send her to a super expensive class and get her certified. It was all reimbursed by work, fortunately. The last canine unit they had suddenly dropped off the grid and wasn't responding, so Doug was next in line. Thankfully, he was able to bill his training back to the company that he worked for under first responder credits, so it all worked out. Plus, he got a super trained dog out of the deal. He didn't tell anybody she was actually full wolf, probably against tons of laws. Every time they asked what breed Challenger was, he'd always agree with whatever their guess was. For training and the official doggy certificate, she actually needed a few years, but there wasn't that kind of time, so she got the crash course. It was good enough, compared with her natural instincts. Doug couldn't wait to see her in real action. Doug took a few more turns at a slow pace and passed a few more cars that were in the ditch. He kept going and didn't even look. He was getting on the freeway now and needed to focus. The on-ramp was always where everyone wiped out. He passed 3 more cars which were in the ditch and had to let out a chuckle. The tow trucks were going to make a mint in the morning and probably tomorrow too. Doug shook his head in disbelief. The freeway was always a trick in itself. The semis were flying by in full chains, chewing up the snow and ice easily. The snow was coming down at about a medium pace, and the windshield wipers could keep up in normal city conditions. But on the freeway, it was a different story. Doug had to flip the wiper speed up to high as he felt like he was driving through a flurry. The cars were in the right lane in the ice like idiots. They were plowing into each other and into the beginnings of snowdrifts every quarter mile or so. It was like nobody had ever driven in the snow before. The semis were in the left lane. The cars couldn't drive in that lane because their wheelbases wouldn't line up properly properly, and they couldn't keep up anyway with the low center clearance shoving against the snow that the semis were passing over. Doug's truck had the comparably spaced wheelbase and the right clearance and could keep up with the speed of the giant tractors easily. He could see their taillights easily, and they could see him, and he drove in their ruts all the way to work with the flurry going right on over him. He got to his exit and passed 3 more people in the ditch as the off-ramp turned into ice. He slowed back down with a little time to spare before the skating rink as the city began turning into ice. It was a lot colder here than the warmer area a few hundred miles to the north where the storm actually was, but the city was a little warmer than his house where he'd driven from, so it was icy here, but not accumulating quite as much. Basically, the warm moisture from the snow was hitting the cold air in his weather pattern, and he was stuck on the cold side. He coasted through a few more intersections carefully, with not as much audio cues for safety awareness. He could hear the radio again. The talk was that the storm up north was one of the worst storms ever to hit. The snowstorm was heavy but contained in a sort of gorge. Law enforcement was asking everyone to stay home that could stay home unless in an emergency. Emergency crews would be out to clear the roads in a few days as the snowplow trucks had been decommissioned by the mayor again. No de-icing had been put on the roads. No trucks had been prepared. Everything was awesome, like usual. Doug pulled around a corner and saw the appropriate parking garage. There were guards right inside the parking garage, which was definitely unusual. They waved to Doug to stop and ask to see his ID. Doug showed them his ID. Doug was on the list apparently, which was a positive. The guards told Doug to proceed to the roof and meet the next contact. The guards motioned to the guard shack, and then the gates lifted and they waved Doug through. As he started through the parking garage, he heard them radio codes back and forth. As Doug found the ramp to ascend, he thought about it and assumed they were radioing up to notify them that he was coming up. Doug went up one ramp, then another, and he lost count of the ramps, and suddenly he was back in the snow again, was at a much higher elevation again, and there was quite a flurry going on. Doug kept a slow pace and drove up the ramp safely. There seemed to be a few other signs of people driving up here this morning, but not many. In the distance, as the middle of the roof of the parking garage, there was a helicopter. As Doug got closer, he noticed this wasn't simply any helicopter. It was one of those huge 16-seaters. He'd heard them seating up to 20 people, depending on the configuration, but then there was less room for gear. They could hold around 8,000 pounds, which was plenty for a 12-man team in full gear. Doug parked, got out, and put Challenger's Ear Pro and Eye Pro on, and then let her out. Challenger started tromping around in the snow, smelling and trying to find a secluded place to potty. Looking around for someone who seemed to be in charge, Doug saw that everyone appeared to be in the helicopter waiting. No doubt the cold didn't accommodate everyone hanging out outside. Doug climbed back into the truck and got his bag and locked the truck up, and then started heading over to the helo. He tried to line up with the pilot to make eye contact, since nobody was outside to guide him into the helicopter. The pilot was wearing night goggles and saw Doug approach, and then stopped to kneel about 50 meters away. Challenger saw all this and wanted to check out the new situation that Doug was heading towards. She galloped over to him in the multiple feet of snow that had been in the process of accumulating, her paws spreading out wide so she could get extra traction and momentum. She was covered in snow and the happiest dog in the universe, apparently completely fearless of the mammoth machine making miniature snow tornado. The crew chief opened the sliding door of the helicopter and kicked out some stairs. He looked around and then pointed to Doug and motioned to himself. Doug threw his pack around to carry on his chest and ducked low to approach the giant helo. As he got closer and closer, the wake pushed him back, but the rotors were only at a quarter power, so not too bad. After getting used to the pressure, Doug walked the few more feet in the snow, then looked inside. 11 other people, including a pilot. The guy that opened the door said, "I'll take your pack." He had to yell because the rotors were fairly loud. The rotors made the area circling the helicopter like a miniature snow tornado. Standing in the snow swirl was very uncomfortable, and Doug wanted to get inside as soon as possible. He readjusted his shemagh to make sure it didn't go flying off, and some more of the snow didn't get in. Then he zipped up the collar on his jackets. Doug then handed the guy his pack, and the guy handed Doug's pack back to someone else. Then the guy reached out, thinking it was Doug's turn to get on the helicopter, but it wasn't. Doug moved out of the way and Challenger came into view. The guy stepped back in a comical fashion as if that would somehow prevent the next series of events. Doug pointed up into the helicopter, and that's all that Challenger needed. She was so big she could stretch out into the helicopter with the front part of her body by getting back on her back legs, and then she hopped in, seeing that there was room for her. Having nobody now to help him climb in, Doug clambered into the helicopter by himself. Challenger was already going person to person and shoe to shoe, downloading the information off of everyone. She wiggled and shoved her way through the aisles and made sure she got everyone, her tail hitting several people in the face as she progressed. When she had completed making sure everyone was okay to be on the same helicopter as Doug, Challenger stopped at a spot that had room for both of them, and she slumped down in a big hairy ball. He made his way past everyone. He noted a few specialty precision rifles as he passed, including a Dragunov and a PSG-1. They were all pointed down, as is appropriate on a helicopter, then sat down next to the seat that Challenger had found. Upon seating, Doug thanked her for finding both of them a seat. This made her happy, and she smiled, letting her giant teeth and oversized tongue flop out. Doug got her bowl out of her pack, and it sprung to full size. Then Doug squirted some water in from the tank in his new pack and set her dish down. She drank it all, then picked the bowl back up and handed it back to him. Doug took the bowl and collapsed it back down and shoved it in her pack. She thought for a second as if doing some extremely complicated trigonometry calculation, and then shook, covering everyone in the cabin in water. Doug found this extremely hilarious, but he had to almost bite himself to stop from laughing. He silently patted her on the head as if this was the right thing to do. Before anyone could really say anything, the rotors sped up and the helicopter took off. Apparently Doug was the last one that needed to get on. He didn't see a lot of vehicles in the parking lot below, so maybe there had been multiple stops. There's no way these people could have carpooled here in that few vehicles with all their gear. Everyone was quiet though, so Doug stayed quiet, and after a moment of liftoff, they were away. Chapter 16, Doug. Up and away, morning, day 1. The cabin was surprisingly quiet due to all the new technology that had come through, and you could theoretically talk if you wanted. Usually you needed headsets for everyone to then communicate it over radios, but that wasn't the case here. We were cruising at what felt like over 100 miles per hour, and still nobody talked. Challenger didn't seem to mind. Doug had tried to drive her around on the freeway a bit, so she was used to the motion and speed. He was able to get around 85 miles per hour safely where he was at without getting into trouble, and she handled it fine. This seemed to be no different. She lay there seemingly bored. She probably wanted to go play in the snow some more. She probably would be in the snow again soon. It was snowing so hard, and they were going so fast that Doug didn't even bother trying to look outside. The chairs were relaxing, and it was warm enough in the cabin that Doug was able to unzip most of his layers. Everyone else had done the same. Doug was wearing his warm layers, but not his winter rain layers. It hadn't been nasty enough at his house, only around 20 degrees or so. Sub 20, though, you never knew what was going to happen. Could be freezing rain, hail, sleet. The Pacific Northwest had 50 names for the stuff. Doug had thought about snowshoes, but knew he could fashion his own if he absolutely had to. Only had to make sure he didn't cut himself in the process. He'd relaxed in his chair for a little bit, and Challenger had dozed off when a voice came over the loudspeaker. "This is your captain speaking. You can identify as me as Mike for the purpose of this excursion. We're cruising at an altitude of blah 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 blah, going about 120 whatever. We expect to reach a nice prepared landing zone in a little under 2 hours. Crossing the storm barrier would be dangerous, so forget that. We have to get there in some sort of arc fashion. Also, we have an incoming transmission from the host of this trip, so everyone, listen up." A voice, not one originating from the helicopter, but from very far away, come online. "Hello, everyone. Everything you're about to hear is top secret proprietary, and you agreed to full confidentiality when you signed up and boarded the helicopter. As of last night, our electrical infrastructure grid has been under more cyber attack than usual, so much so they actually managed to knock out the dam." Everyone seemed confused by this, as we'd never lost power, so Doug looked down, and Challenger had been looking up and searched for the disembodied voice, and then gave up and got bored and rested her head back down. The voice continued as if we all wouldn't have anything to think about by this news.
There wasn't an interruption because some brand new failsafes kicked in, and the dam went into manual mode. Technically, that's where the issue should have stopped, as we have many redundancies in place. However, in tandem with this unprecedented cyber attack, there was a physical element as well. The voice continued more, barely giving time for the group to process. Separatists have taken over the dam when it went into manual mode and capitalized on the automated defenses being down. Security was easily overrun, and what is technically a foreign power now controls the biggest, and otherwise most reliable, electricity contributor in our region. The engineers on site know how to get the system back online, but they are locked in a safe room that's independent of the larger system, as it predates the technology updates. Someone started to get frustrated and asked where we fit in. They were wondering why the National Guard isn't taking care of it. Why any one of the 100 other alphabet soup agencies aren't sending in their myriad of private militaries. The voice kept talking, despite the side chatter it seemingly couldn't hear. The powers that be wish to keep this quiet. Every military black ops action has to eventually be accounted for, and they'd rather keep a soft coup off the books. Your mission is to infiltrate the dam perimeter, neutralize the separatists, and get the dam back online. A replacement security team will be there within 48 hours with updated orders, and will lock the place down. Shut your phones off and your radios and throw them in the protective bags you've been provided. No one can ever know you are here. Doug assumed there was supposed to be more to the message, but it broke up into static. The feed was cut. Everyone got out their phones and radios and shut them off and threw them in the bags that the pilot had thrown back. They were strange bags that insulated the electronics from electronic signals. Concerts used them when people got pissy about people wanting to take a picture or two with their phone or record their favorite song. Doug had also recalled them being used if people were afraid of bad guys remotely compromising their phones and using them for listening devices or compromising data integrity. Doug had also recalled they came in handy when visiting foreign countries while in airports and hotels. Either way, everyone's phones and radios were now shut off, and that was that. Doug noticed it conveniently fit in one of Challenger's pockets, so that's where his went. Doug sat back and relaxed and dozed off for a bit. He hadn't slept much once the special alarm had gone off, which was basically a special issue watch turned red and started freaking out. Doug wasn't sure how long he'd been out, but it couldn't have been more than an hour or so until there seemed to be a commotion in the cabin. This jolted Doug awake, and he was immediately alert. Challenger was very upset and started growling and barking, not so much at people, but at the entire situation. Something shook the helicopter and the lights dimmed. Doug heard a startling voice from somewhere. "It happened again!" The pilot came over the speaker. "Buckle! Something's wrong! We're losing! Everything's shutting! Taking down!" There was more, but it was muffled as comms were now down and he could only hear conflicting noise through the cabin. Doug saw in between flashes of snow that they were traveling really fast, and there were trees everywhere. Doug buckled up quick and put his legs around Challenger. He recalled that in video games, the first and sometimes even second helicopter sent to rescues always get knocked out of the air. They descended probably as controlled as possible before all of the remaining electronics in the helicopter ceased to function. Chapter 17, Doug, ground level, midday, day 1. Doug didn't remember very much. There were holes of the past 10 minutes missing. He looked at his watch and readjusted that assessment. There were holes of the past several hours missing. Next to his watch was his wristband. It was pointing off somewhere, then somewhere else. More of Doug's situational awareness came back. Doug realized he was sideways against a tree. It hurt to move, but he sat up properly. Thankfully, he was wearing his snow gear. He wiggled his other hand and it moved okay. He used both hands to fully zip his jackets up and pull his hood up. His hood had a little snow in it, and he wiggled the snow out so he wouldn't freeze his head, and then shuffled his glove over his hand to get anything off that, then put his hood on. He tried to stand up, and it took a couple tries. He eventually used a tree as leverage and climbed himself up until he was upright and leaned against the tree. Doug looked around and saw a ton of tracks in the snow. It looked like paw prints and dragging. There was wreckage everywhere. He turned around and looked at the tree, and there were metal pieces above where he was that looked like they'd only barely missed his head. Doug carefully and quietly walked around the crash site to see what there was to see. He walked back and forth until he understood the trajectory of the crash landing and found the cabin of the helo.
The cabin was all in one piece, and the chairs were in place and no bodies. He checked the area for the pilot and pulled open the door. Mike was there and was unresponsive. Doug took one of his double-layer gloves off his hand and checked for a pulse. Mike was unsurprisingly dead. Doug checked for his dog tags, and he didn't have any, so he grabbed Mike's wallet instead and put his glove back on. The cabin wasn't on fire or anything, which was good. It allowed Doug to take a moment and say a silent prayer for Mike, that the helicopter angels would take him up to helicopter heaven with all the other brave pilots that crash and die so that everyone else can continue. With that done, Doug looked around again, feeling pressed for time. Some fires had tried to start, but in the snow and the pressure and the way they crashed, it wasn't going to happen. Their packs were laying everywhere, as they'd only been set in the back for easy access. Doug easily found his, as it was the last one to go in. He pulled it out and inspected it. It was intact, so he grabbed his sunglasses out and put them on and put his pack on. It had warmed up a few degrees and there wasn't any wind, so he didn't need to put any extra layers on yet. He looked down at his wristband and tried to assess where Challenger was, but the arrow was moving back and forth and all around. It needed to be resynced, it looked like something had done a soft reset on it. His watch was decently shielded from magnetic interference, so unless it was a hit from a direct major blast specifically at it, it was fine. He bumped the compass button and figured out which way he was facing, as well as his coordinates, then bumped it again and it went back to timekeeping mode. He needed a map to verify what those coordinates exactly meant, as he didn't have a map, not knowing where he was going. Doug looked around and still saw no survivors, but drag marks everywhere. He went back to the front of the helicopter and found the backup map for the pilot and silently thanked him. He looked at the map, and as soon as he checked on the crew, he stuffed it in a special pocket in his jacket for map-sized objects. He eventually found the tail of the helicopter. It was smashed off on a tree 20 yards away. The helicopter definitely wasn't going to be flying again. Doug was going to consider himself lucky, and then remembered on this model of the helicopter's maiden flight that the helicopter suddenly burst into pieces mid-flight. The tragedy sent the approval of the helicopter back a year and greenlit a ton of new safety measures as they were able to figure out all the failure points. That's the only real reason why everyone survived. This helicopter definitely didn't come down by itself. He patted it on the side gently in a show of appreciation and then sent out to find his crew and best friend in the whole world. They'd been through way worse than this, and he was sure Challenger was fine. He didn't call out for her, though, because there was no way to know if the bad guys had come to check out the crash. Doug followed a few of the drag marks the wrong direction before realizing they were all pointed in a single direction. Doug got into his pack and got out his trusty rifle, his FNC. He secured a mag in the mag well and racked around as quietly as he could and make sure it went back in the chamber okay, then popped open the buttstock and snapped it in place. He had his sidearm available as always, but wasn't messing around. He followed the drag marks for 100 yards into the woods. After about 100 yards, he started noticing quite contrasting blood smears on the ground. First, he would see a single blood smear, and then that would go away, and then he'd see a drag mark from another direction. And then there'd be a blood smear from the other direction. Doug drew his rifle and kept stomping through the snow as quietly as he could to where these drag marks went. Eventually, after several hundred yards through the forest, he felt a pair of eyes on him. He looked around and saw nothing. He took a few more steps and heard a low growl. It sounded, or rather the rumble felt like it was a little over 20 yards out. He put his rifle down with as much authority and confidence as he could muster and said, "Challenger?" The rumble stopped. That was either good or bad. Doug shuffled to the left and right and, nearly imperceptibly silent, heard something step forward. He looked around in every direction and tried to step towards where he heard the noise. "Challenger?" Doug tried again, this time with more confidence as he realized his voice was shakier than he thought. He heard very distinct charging through the brush and rolled his eyes. Sounded like a bear running through the forest, but he already recognized that crashing anywhere. There was his best buddy in the whole world. She stood up and easily put her paws on his shoulders, wanting to give him big kisses. He struggled to hold up both of their weight, not that he could do anything about it, but he tried to resist and get her down anyway. Her face was covered in blood, but upon inspection, thankfully it didn't seem to be her own. She got down, having been relieved that her buddy was alive, and thought for a second. Then she was reminded of something and tried to lead Doug off somewhere. Doug stopped her for a second and synced his electronic tether to her. It spun around for a second, recalibrating, then latched onto her. She felt a little vibration that warmed her heart, reestablishing her with a sense of normalcy. That having been done, she guided Doug back through the trail she'd been working on. Chapter 18, Doug, Camp, Afternoon, Day 1. What Doug saw next was definitely a sight to behold. There was his crew strewn out everywhere. Apparently Challenger had pulled them all from the crash one by one into the place where she thought the most logically safe. They were even under trees so they couldn't be seen by aircraft. Then she brought them all food, as there were dead animals everywhere that she had expertly caught. I don't think they taught you that in dog school, Doug said to Challenger. She dropped her mouth open in a pant, blood all over her muzzle, as if to smile at him proudly, tail wagging. He went over to her and got out her bowl and squirted some water in it. She was very thankful for this, and he kept pumping water in until she was done. He wiped her muzzle off with some snow as best as she could. They were trained to not bite when she had her head down in food or water, but he was never completely sure. After she was cleaned up and had water, he drank a bunch of it himself. It wasn't frozen yet, but it was definitely cold. It was easy to get dehydrated, surrounded by tons of undrinkable water. He searched the camp to check on everyone's injuries, and they were all unconscious, but nothing life-threatening from what he could understand. Doug debated the mission versus his crew, and he resolved that the mission could go screw itself, and that the safety and integrity of this crew came first. He immediately had an idea, almost like his response to the situation triggered it. A good idea. He dropped his pack at the site. Hopefully, if any of them woke up, they would recognize it and figure out that he'd be coming back for it. Doug then started walking off and patted at his side. Challenger immediately followed. She wanted to protect the rest of the crew, but she knew they were safe for now, and whatever Doug wanted to do was more important. They walked back to the crash site carefully by mostly memory. Only had to check his watch for direction once. Thankfully, there was no sign of anyone else discovering the site yet, if they were looking. He grabbed some paracord that he'd found in the cabin and lashed all of the packs together so they were in a stack and would glide easily without the snow getting in them. Then he lashed the packs to Challenger's harness. When that was done, he grabbed some loose branches that he'd found on the way there and told Challenger to go. She thought for a second and figured out what was going on. The stuff needed to go back to the pack that she dragged to safety. Off she went, and Doug used the branches and the fresh falling snow to cover their trail. Challenger would head off about 20 yards ahead, get the vibration from the collar, and know to stop. They did this all the way back to camp, and Doug noted that he did a pretty good job at covering the tracks by shuffling the snow around with his branches. He now couldn't even tell exactly which way they'd come from. He tried to cover up the blood with snow, but stopped because the fresh snow above was covering it pretty well, and it was making the return trip too long. Within a few hours, it'd be like they'd never been between the two spots. He unhooked Challenger using the carabiners he'd scavenged on the helicopter. She was happy to have it off, but seemingly to be perfectly okay with dragging the load also. She ran around and went and found something to do, probably was licking every single person on the face that was unconscious. That cracked Doug up, and he let out a little chuckle. "You lick all their faces all you want, puppy dog." She looked at him with appreciation for the approval. Doug also had saved all the emergency flares from the helicopter, as well as the oversized onboard first aid kit. He grabbed the big first aid kit and set it aside and set the road flares on top. He found a shovel on someone's pack and started digging a hole, trying to get to bare earth. He wouldn't be starting a fire now, but he would by nightfall. Even if he marched there without the crew, he wouldn't be to the dam by dark, based on the map. He took a second to review. Making a dusk raid sounded interesting, but he wanted the enemy to feel comfortable. They'd stay up hardcore for the first 24 hours and think they were successful with their helicopter stunt that they somehow pulled, and be exhausted by the time Doug's team hit them at dawn. Doug at first maybe thought the helicopter got hacked, but then he thought it was a series of EMP bursts. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Whatever it was, nobody was going to risk another helicopter until that system was shut down. Doug was digging and hit dirt after about 1.5 feet. He wasn't very good at digging. He knew someone who was, but they were far away, unfortunately. He'd rather have that person here than some of these guys, but he was sure they were they were okay as soon as they woke up. Challenger came back after a few minutes and saw what Doug was doing. She thought this was pretty freaking funny and came over and started helping. With the two of them working together, they dug a pretty big pit down to bare earth. As soon as they were done, Challenger promptly went down into the pit and laid down. Doug threw his hands up exaggeratingly, and Challenger didn't flinch. Doug didn't think about it until after he'd thrown his hands up, but he was satisfied with the result. He got really upset about being around dogs that flinched. It reminded him too much of rampant animal abuse. He went off to gather whatever branches and fuel he could find, and before he left he checked all of his crew, and they were soundly sleeping. He hoped that none of their necks were broken, but he didn't think so. None of them were choking or gagging or suffocating, so it was okay to leave them here. He lifted his head and took all their hoods and made sure they were under the people's heads so their heads didn't turn into popsicles. He got about 20 yards away, and Challenger sprung up after him to see what they were going to go do next. This apparently was very fun for Challenger, because they were going to get sticks. Doug would chop all the low-hanging sticks down, gathering up the dead branches. He left the ones that they might use as improvised shelters when everyone woke up. It was starting to get dark already, he noticed. He forgot how stupidly fast it got dark in the winter up here. The process was arduous. Doug would cut a branch down with his army surplus knife, then Challenger would grab it from him and run around with it. Doug would cut down another branch and set it down. Challenger would come back with no branch and pick up that branch. He tried to trick her by holding the branches, but then she wanted to tug them out of his hand. This went on for about a half an hour, and Doug ended up with only a few branches of his own. It was getting way too dark, and the only branches left would be in the closest trees. He wasn't worried about anyone seeing the fire. It was the smoke that was the biggest concern. With snow everywhere, he wasn't able to make a sneaky pit that would hide the smoke. He brought his few sticks back in the dusk and barely made his way. He didn't want to use his flashlight light because he felt like in the dusk, flashlights made everything worse. So partially by memory and partially by following a big white dog butt, he made his way to camp with his few branches. He tripped over a down tree at one point, but it'd likely be soaked, and he'd have to completely dig it out and saw it down, and there was no way he could do that. Chopping it down, even if he had an axe, would make tons of noise that would travel for miles. He didn't recognize a saw in anyone's pack, but maybe someone had a discreet folding saw in their pack somewhere. Maybe when they woke up, he could assign someone to take care of that. He loosely remembered where it was from the direction of the camp. It wasn't too far and only partially buried. Doug got back to camp, only to find out that the sticks that Challenger had taken were strewn everywhere. She looked at him happily like she'd done a good thing, and he agreed with her and got a snack out of her pack and put it in a dish, and she gobbled it up in moments. Doug swished some snow around in it to clean it out and then flicked the moisture off and put it back in her pack. Doug then gathered up all the sticks, starting with the smallest first, and made a cylindrical space in the middle. After the smaller sticks, he put the medium-sized branches and then the biggest he was able to find. He'd get it started and then try to find more. With every branch placed in the pit, he found the first aid kit in the growing darkness, and within 20 minutes it'd be pitch black. There were 3 emergency flares, and Doug was confident he only needed one. He wasn't worried about needed them for a rescue, as nobody was coming for them as long as the other side could knock helicopters out of the air at will. He popped the cap on the flare and carefully set it in the hole he made. The magnesium burned extremely hot, and within seconds the branches were thawed and catching fire. It'd be safe to leave alone, because it wasn't like anything was going to burn down that wasn't supposed to around here. Using the light, starting from the flare and starting the fire, Doug grabbed his flashlight out and started hunting for more branches. Doug took about 20 steps away through the deep snow and turned around. He had chosen this spot well. The fire wasn't going to melt any snow directly above and cause it to flop down and put the fire out. The tree cover should capture the light, escaping from far away if anyone was looking at this specific spot from high ground. Chapter 19, Doug, Night and Cold, Nightfall, Day 1. Doug turned around and walked into the forest, flashlight in hand, looking for any sort of branches or logs he could find. He'd taken the paracord from early and used some branches to make another sled, a better one this time. The second the sun fell below the skyline, the temperature was dropping a degree every few minutes and it was getting cold. The sled would sort of mask what he was doing, and he could carry more branches this way. In half an hour or so, he had enough branches and some decent-sized logs to where it would keep the fire going most of the night. This method still preserved the closest branches for emergencies and shelters for the guys. Doug made his way back, and the fire had been going, but was dwindling down. He carefully put these sticks around the outside of the fire so they could warm up and not immediately drown the fire out. Eventually they would catch as well. If not, he would roll them in when the time was appropriate. The snow around the fire didn't really melt away into the fire and put it out. It was cold enough to where the snowy walls around the fire melted, refroze, melted, and refroze. Eventually it was an icy bowl at the perfect distance for the heat-to-cold ratio to balance. Mother Nature had figured it out all by herself, just like she usually does. Doug was about to head out for a third time and heard someone stirring. Challenger heard this too and trotted over and started licking the guy's face. The guy's face. Doug had to act like he didn't approve of it and tried to get her to stop. That was an act in futility, but at least he pretended to try. The guy got up with a jerk and thought his last memories were being eaten alive by a giant monster dog. He flailed hopelessly. And Challenger thought this was a fun game and started dancing around with her beautiful floofy tail whooshing around. The guy's memory started slowly coming back to him as he groggily asked what happened. Doug got him up to speed and asked if anything was broken. The guy seemed okay and thankful and shakily got up and went to find his pack in the big backpack pile. The packs weren't laying in the snow specifically. Doug had leaned them all up against each other frame to frame, so the important bits weren't in the snow. Doug asked if the newly awakened guy would watch the fire, and he said he would, and then he thanked Doug. Doug went out to find more fuel for the fire with his new sled, and Challenger came with. Before long, Challenger was digging around and finding branches by herself. She apparently thought this was a fun new game, and in no time at all, Doug had enough branches to last most of the night for sure. Challenger was doing a good job leading him back to the camp each time. On the way back, Doug wondered if it was possible one of these people was in on the sabotage. He doubted it, though, because he knew the crews for this were always picked at random. There was no token deadbeat slime ball that everyone was worried about because everyone got fleshed out fast. Eventually, everyone in the group would be solid. When Doug arrived back at camp, a couple more people were awake, with tents starting to pop up strategically. One of the medical-type people had woke up and that was starting a much more in-depth medic. That was a much more in-depth medic than Doug was and started checking everyone out more closely. Another was getting everyone out of their tents and getting out everyone's tents and setting them up. A third was starting food and boiling water. Doug eyeballed the fire and the amount of wood-based fuel he had. Guys, it's going to be a long night. Does anyone have a saw so I can get a log or two? One of the crew dug through their pack and got him a really high-end folding saw. Here you go, we'll make short work of even frozen timber. Doug thanked him, and Challenger went off to find that log. Doug thought that the camp was going nicely and almost tripped over the stupid log again. He used the shovel he had borrowed and started digging around the log so he could get down to the bottom. Challenger took the cue and started digging as well, enjoying the game they were playing. Once they were dug, Challenger looked at Doug as if to point to her mouth with it open. Doug rolled his eyes in the dark and gave her a pat on the head and got her a treat out of her pack. He set it down on a piece of fallen tree and then told her to go ahead. She gobbled it up and went back to dig herself a hole to rest in so she'd be out of the wind. Doug got to sawing and within a half an hour had sawed up 3 solid portions of log. The added bonus was that hopefully nobody'd ever trip on it again. He set the 3 pieces of log on his sled and dragged it back to camp, following the white dog butt all the way. When he got back, food had been combined, prepared, and was ready, and all the tents were up and almost everyone was awake. The few that remained unconscious had been examined and then put in their tents and wrapped up in their bags. Someone was maintaining a cool, special water boiler they'd bought. You fed in small sticks, and in return you got full-speed boiling water. Every few minutes it spit the now purified water out through a hose into a second pot that was cooling down for people to fill up their water systems with. Doug sat down to eat and stuck the shovel in the ground. Don't know whose shovel this is, but had to borrow it to take care of the camp. Much appreciated. Everyone looked and someone Doug wasn't familiar with went and grabbed it. No problem. Glad it isn't lost. Heard it was you we have to thank for the rescue? Doug restrained a chuckle. Actually, I have Challenger to thank for that. I was unconscious also. I didn't find you guys for a while. Someone asked, is that where all the dead animals are from? Doug had forgot about that. Yeah, she did that when I was unconscious also. To Doug's surprise, nobody spat out the food. It had all been cleaned and heated up properly, of course. Someone spoke up. Well, we're mighty thankful, friend. You and your fur ball there really saved us. Someone else spoke up in the dark from their spot between bites. Very thankful, but not so sure about the mission. Not that you were expected to complete it alone, or that we aren't thankful that you chose to save us, but I wanted to voice appreciation anyway. Doug thought about it and spoke. Yeah, I know. It was an easy choice, though. Even if I could have magically completed the mission myself, I have a feeling you all would have done the same for me. In the firelight, he saw them all slowly nod, not because they admitted out of guilt, but because it's true. Someone else spoke up. It's alright either way. I'm pretty sure we can still complete the mission. We might not be at full strength, but we'll have the highest probability for success now. Everyone thought on that point a moment, then the guy continued. It's probably what you were thinking anyway, right? He was speaking to Doug. Doug responded, that's exactly what I was thinking. They'll be tired and lazy by the time we'll be recovered, rested, and on their front doorstep. There's the matter about supposing to actually recover the engineers in any semblance of reasonable time. Doug's thought trailed off, unsure of where to go from there. The group thought about it, and someone responded. We'll have someone stay here with the injured, and you can hit them hard before sunrise. The engineers will have to be resourceful and figure it out. I've seen an entire engineering wing get trapped in active shooter situations before, and I wouldn't want to mess with them. The group nodded and finished their dinner. Someone in one of the tents stirred. The medic got up from eating and crawled in their tent to check on them. Within 20 minutes, we had a new addition to the group. Doug looked around the camp circle and counted that 2 were still unconscious. The medic would have to stay behind, with someone running security, which meant they'd be down to 4. They'd be down 4. Doug felt something come up under his arm and almost made him knock his bowl over. It was empty, though. Challenger must be hungry. Doug went and climbed through his bag and brought out a bag of doggy kibble. This made Challenger go nuts, and she started hopping up and down on her back legs like a happy child. Doug gave her a stern look, and she planted her butt back down and tried to stop her tail from wagging. He filled the bowl over halfway with food, and she waited patiently, everyone watching now to see if Doug was going to get eaten instead of the food if he didn't hurry up. He backed up and gave her the thumbs up, and she went for it. The food was gone in moments, and she was happy. He squirted some water in the dish, and she drank it until she was done, and then went off to be by herself for a few minutes. It was a paper bowl, so Doug threw it in the fire and washed off his camping utensil with some snow and wiped it off and put it back in his pack. Everyone else was done collecting water for a bit, so he used the clean water to fill up his pack supply. It was barely staying warm enough to not freeze. Doug didn't want to check the temperature on his watch. Everyone sat quietly and patiently, waiting for more decisions or thoughts to come out. Every few minutes, someone would zipper button something up a little bit more. Everyone was sitting directly in the snow, having made imprints exactly how they wanted to sit. It was funny how that worked. You were so insulated and waterproof that you could sit in snow for hours, and it was like a comfy chair. Someone got up and started partitioning the stumps that Doug had brought on his makeshift sled. He spoke up after a few seconds. I'll take first watch. Everyone should go crash. Everyone looked around and nodded. Doug was exhausted. He patted on his leg and nothing. He looked at his band and saw which way the arrow was pointing and then pressed a button on his wristband. Normally, the further Challenger would get, the collar would vibrate more frequently the further she got. This allowed her to move back and forth and use it like an echo locator. If it vibrated less, she was headed in the right direction. If he pressed the button, it'd ping her and let her know he was looking for her. Doug didn't yell or scream for her because it was late and the sound would travel. Instead, he got ready and crawled into bed. He got nestled into a sleep system that someone had set up for him, and he saw that they didn't know what to do with the smaller pad. He grabbed the dog bed and stuck it by his feet where Challenger was ideally going to lay down. He adjusted each of his layers properly, making sure each was dry and each was zipped up. They were all oversized, breathed great, and were very comfortable. He was starting to doze off with his rifle in his sleeping bag, wondering why Challenger had never come to bed, when he heard the loudest wolf howl he'd ever heard in his entire life. Before he even had a chance to face palm, the wolf had already taken a breath and let one out even louder. Doug was pretty sure everyone in the camp just urinated themselves if they needed to go even remotely at all. He pulled his covers over his head as if to distance himself from what had just happened. Inside, though, he was very proud of Challenger. She was trying to balance search heritage with the mission at hand, and she was doing an amazing job. He didn't mind if she went out and did that. As he laid there waiting for her to come back, he thought maybe she was looking for her mom or siblings. He thought it was possible, but he also thought that maybe it was a warning that she was here and that she owned the freaking entire area for the night. Doug started to drift off, and a short bit later, in crawled Challenger. She was extremely happy with herself. Challenger went past her dog bed and flapped down right on top of Doug. He wiggled around sideways to grab her pad and moved it to his free side and slid partially onto it. She scooted over more, and then they shared the two pads together and fell fast asleep. Chapter 20, Doug, Go Time, Pre-Dawn, Day 2. Doug woke up with a jolt. Had he slept in? He checked his watch. He still had a few hours before dawn, but based on his old schedule, it felt like he'd slept in. They hadn't got him up to do sleep watch. It sort of bummed him out, but he was okay with it also. He wiggled back and forth until he finally got out from under the massive dog. After he was free, he dug through his pack and found a fresh pair of socks. He put a fresh pair of socks on and then got his boots back on and went to see how it was going. There was hustle and bustle of everyone getting ready to go. Breakfast was already nearly done, and there was a fresh pile of sticks and water was going non-stop from the water boiler. Someone brought Doug over some food, which he graciously accepted. Someone explained to him that they let him sleep since he'd done so much. He thanked them. The food was delicious. The medic was asleep, but Doug asked anyway, softly conversing over the glow of the campfire in the snow pit. "Will we ever get our last two buddies awake?" Two of the guys looked at each other and everyone shook their heads. A third spoke softly. "We're going to post a guy up here with the medic, and this is going to remain base command. If they try to come and get us, we're going to shred them to pieces, which will leave their base weak. Otherwise, you guys take their base and we'll take up the rear." Doug nodded and finished his breakfast. The rest of the team, sans the two unconscious team members, got up and had breakfast. Soon the fire would have to be put out so it didn't alert the opposing force. Everyone ate as much of the combined meal as they could and drank or collected all the water they needed. Press checks happened all around, and the fire was put out, and it was time to go. Doug held the map out so everyone could see. He turned his compass watch on and showed them where they needed to go and how to get there. Doug had been in this area before fighting fires. A large swath of the area had burned down over the summer. The team would follow the tree line so they wouldn't be walking through a kill zone of cleared forest with virtually no cover. Everyone liked the idea, and off the group went, with Challenger trotting along, wondering what was going on. By Doug's estimate, they had to make the couple-mile hike within the hour to be to the dam barely prior to sunrise. At least a mile of the hike would be up a steep grade, since they were dropped off below the dam instead of behind it. Everyone in the group was in good shape, though. All of their packs were back at base camp, and they only had their rifles and battle kit, which include armor mags and IFAKs to cover first aid. The group had been making good time when they got within about a half a mile of the dam, and something started to seem off. Doug put his hand up, and everyone stopped and checked their sectors. He pressed his hand down, and everyone crouched down. To his surprise, Challenger also got down. He pointed to everyone, then pointed to the ground, and they all nodded. Doug had a bad feeling that there were snares in the area. This would be the perfect spot for them. He doubted there'd be anything like C4, but he could imagine a lot of irritating noisemakers or sharpened logs. Possibly also sharpened sticks in the dirt with feces on them. This area was all snow, though, and there weren't many dry spots. He wasn't sure which traps to even look out for. There could be old traps under snow or new traps above the snow. They walked for about 20 yards and came upon the first one. Doug put his hand up again and everyone stopped. He pointed to one and made a hand motion that looked sort of like a dolphin jumping in the water. Everyone nodded or gave a thumbs up. And over the trap they went, Doug paying special attention to the ground. He dearly hoped there weren't spike pits. Doug noticed someone towards the back of the line documenting the traps on a notepad. Challenger saw the tripwires better than any of them, and she was naturally walking around them. She wouldn't lead, though, because she didn't fully grasp where they were going. Within 10 more minutes of this, they were at a spot they could see the dam's infrastructure, then got back down to conference if they wanted. Ideally, they would have wanted to pull further back, but that involved them sitting around the traps and tripwires. Light was starting to crest the land, and within minutes the sun would be shining directly on the crew. The dam was still in the shadow. Everyone looked through either binoculars or the rifle scopes to scout the infrastructure and area. They only saw 2 people outside. Everyone else must be asleep or exhausted. The two people had some sort of weird cannon thing they'd set up, and there was a flag they had posted claiming the dam. Everyone got off their perch and sat back down in the snow and dirt. It was cold in this area, but everyone was hanging in there. Hopefully they'd be inside soon. He knew his weapon was oiled with a special compound that wouldn't clump up at this temperature, but he wasn't sure if everyone else's were. Hopefully there wouldn't be any critical weapon malfunctions. He couldn't worry about it, though, and looked onward. Doug spoke first. That was definitely them. Someone else spoke. "Did you see that crazy sci-fi cannon?" A third said, "I have 300 blackout subsonic rounds and a can on my rifle that would make this whisper quiet." Doug thought about the options. "We need to take them out quietly, but we need people close enough to capitalize on the advantage." Everyone nodded, and Doug continued, "Let's get up close. 2 3-man teams, an overwatch for each. Do we have anyone else with a suppressed rifle?" Everyone else confirmed. "Yes, I have one. It's all set up for suppressed subsonic as well." Doug responded, "Okay, cool. You're second overwatch then. Is that cool?" The guy nodded. They broke into 2 3-man teams, one for each entrance. One would take the front, the other would take the back. One of the overwatch stayed. They prepared to follow the 3-man team. They broke into 2 3-man teams, one for each entrance. One would take the front, and the other would take the back. One of the overwatch stayed, and they prepared to follow the 3-man team. I think I just said that. I apologize. Doug thought, then spoke. "Check your watches. We go in exactly 3 minutes before the hour. That gives everyone time to get in place. Remember, the security systems are down. The facility is under manual control." They all checked their watches and nodded as Doug spoke, their watches all constantly auto-syncing with each other over local Wi-Fi. Someone said, "See you guys on the other side." They all nodded, and the 2 teams separated and got into position. Doug's team on the side that had the weird cannon on it. The other team circled around to the front entrance, and everyone waited. Doug had eyes on the 2. They looked pretty exhausted, and they were chatting. Doug could hear them a little bit. Something about a revolution that was coming up, and how this would ensure power to the new region they were forming. Doug rolled his eyes and forgot all about Challenger. She was laying down next to him, listening to the separatists also. Challenger seemed to understand that they were the enemy right away. Doug watched them and checked his watch, trying to hide its light from sight. It was very cold out and very windy. Doug regretted leaving his windbreaker at camp, but it would be too noisy here. It felt at least 0, if not slightly colder. Challenger seemed to not even notice, though he could see barely that her fur was getting rustled around. Doug's watch ticked the last few seconds, and it was time. They began to creep forward in the shadows as the sun started to crack the skyline with light. 2 barely audible shots rang out in succession, and the bodies by the cannon fell silently, the actions of the rifles making more noise than the bullets themselves. Doug and his 2 crewmates in Challenger all sprinted from cover and ran to secure the cannon as the bodies dropped. Doug thought he heard similar activity from around the building, but couldn't tell in the wind. Doug ran and stripped the bodies of weapons and ammo. Both bodies had identical patterned AKs. The AKs got slid into a corner for later. The bodies got tossed off the dam. Doug's 3rd teammate covered them. As Doug and his crew were doing that, several more bad guys rushed out of the structure. They were exhausted, and thus their reactions delayed. The reinforcements barely lasted a second apiece, and Doug's and his teammates' ensuing gunfire. The 3rd man on Doug's team quickly stopped temporarily to disable the MP cannon, as Doug and his other partner took aggressive covered positions. Doug's crew didn't have time to search these bodies, and they took sides on the door with Doug taking point. They were about to follow Doug's command to breach when Challenger heard something, broke formation, and ripped one of the downed separatists' throats out. She looked over at the body for a second, thought about it, then got back into breaching formation as if nothing had happened. A nervous chuckle crept from one of the other guys on the breaching team. Apparently he wasn't dead enough for your dog," Doug responded in jest quietly. He didn't need that throat anyway. The blood on Challenger's mouth gave her a big happy red smile as she sat ready for the next round. Doug heard a pat on the shoulder of the guy behind him, and then he got a pat on the shoulder. It was a steel door, but no way to lock it with the security system down. Doug opened it and moved forward to cover one angle, the guys behind him covering the other angle, and blind spot in the corner. Challenger came in last, starting to sniff around. Doug could hear yelling several rooms away and more gunfire. One of the rifles sounded like an AK pattern shotgun, and it was ridiculously loud and authoritative. It was possible that people trying to escape and running into the second crew or 2 engagement points. The second team would be on their own for now, though. Someone ran in and instantly took shots from Doug's 2 counterparts. Yes, there was a chance of them shooting their own guys, but they wouldn't breach rooms like that. Challenger grabbed the body and dragged it outside with the rest and then came back. Room by room, the 2 teams cleared until they had inadvertently worked their way to the control room. Both teams outside the control room, but from different entrances, and both could hear shuffling and breathing from the other room, despite all their ears ringing. Blue didn't, or blah blah. Doug didn't order his team in, and instead yelled, "Blue!" There was a pause. Then 42 was yelled from the other room. Doug yelled, "Moving!" And there was a pause, and from the other room he heard, "Go ahead!" Everyone relaxed a little bit and moved in as predetermined code check was used. They had thankfully reached the second team. Challenger went to check every single person to see if they were okay, and everyone was. She started going to clear the other side herself, and within a few minutes Challenger had dragged all the bodies into a pile outside by the cannon. There was an IT expert in the group, and he confirmed all the cameras and security were offline. Doug found a floor plan on the table where the bad guys had been trying to isolate where the engineers were hiding. There were only a few places left in the floor plans they hadn't checked. Doug didn't feel like trading people in an accidental fight with the engineers and came up with a plan. He asked the IT guy to patch him through to the radio, and he did. Doug spoke as calmly but succinctly through the intercom, which echoed through the whole facility. "Attention, hydroelectric dam employees. You are now free from the insurrectionists. We are hungry and tired. You are probably hungry and tired. We aren't coming to go get you, but we are here to rescue you," Doug continued. "We need to get enough of this turned back on so we can alert the powers that be that our mission was a success. They have the next part of the mission. We have injured that we need to move in here so they are safe. Don't know if you noticed, but it's really cold outside. We hope to talk to you as soon as you feel like coming out. Not going to mess with any of these systems or anything. We know how fragile it all probably is." Doug looked around and everyone either nodded or shrugged. Doug finished up. "Thank you again for your cooperation. We hope to have a replacement security team to you as soon as you come out and help us. Then we'll be out of your hair. Thank you for your time and cooperation. Feel free to come out anytime." Doug let go of the mic button and set the handset down. "Okay, guys, let's go notify Overwatch and get our buddies up in here and out of the cold." Chapter 21, Doug, in the coming hours. Day 2. Doug left a 3-man team in both Overwatch at the dam and then took his 2 guys and Challenger back to base camp. The 2 final crew members that had been unconscious were now awake and uninjured. One turned out to be their demolitions expert, and the other was an expert in traps, snares, and the like. They were getting ready to go for a third group to help when Doug and the team got back. Doug let them know that the area was secure and it was time to pack up and get to the dam. The trap expert went ahead and detected and marked every trap he could find on the handwritten map they were working on. Doug and the remainder of the team picked up the camp and put together the sleeping bags and tents and made sure everything miscellaneous was brought with. The fire had already been put out, and Doug used the paracord and carabiners and made another improvised sled, and Challenger dragged all the bags back up to the dam. They all met up back at the top, and the demolitions guy destroyed the EMP gun so nobody could use it. Doug got the sled off Challenger, who didn't mind it but was happy to get it off. They all helped carry the bags inside and set them up in the big conference room to dry out. The designated cook on the team had got everyone's random food together and made another meal out of it. They secured the entrances and had 2 guys with rifles on top, but didn't expect a second force to be attacking. All the weapons were collected and put in a pile. They were nearly all identically patterned AKs for the rifles. They were miscellaneous pistols, including some high points and some popular Austrian polymer pistols and some Makarovs. They eventually found the stash of weapons from the prior security team, which were all identically patterned MP5s. Hardly appropriate for these conditions. There were multiple thousands of rounds found for the AKs, but none found for the MP5s. Everyone thought this was weird and assumed the assault team grabbed all the 9mm for resupply. One of the teams eyeballed an MP5 and broke it down and stuffed the pieces in his pack. Everyone else shrugged. It wasn't like the guy was going to sell it. No doubt they'd be called again and expected to be ready, but then he remembered they were getting paid handsomely. He took the pieces back out, reassembled it, and threw it back on the pile with the rest. Doug suspected the engineers had hid themselves in whatever passed for the armory here, but I wasn't too worried about it. They ate and rotated guard shifts and relaxed in the warmth and hum of the dam. It wasn't long before they heard a big vault door open deeper in the dam, and everyone tensed up for a second and then relaxed. Doug spoke. "We can't scare them and make them think it's a trick, so let's relax and let them get comfortable so we can work together." Everyone nodded. Eventually, the skittish engineers made their way to the sound and smell of everyone eating. They'd brought some MREs and canned food of their own, and it was all cooked up and distributed, and good times were had. The engineers liked Challenger, and they all took turns playing with her. The comm systems got reset properly and set up. Command was notified, and the replacement security team was sent out. The team spent the remainder of the day resting and swapping out security details. Chapter 22, Doug, Finality, Late Night, Day 2. Everyone had turned their comms and cell phones back on. Thankfully, they had all been in those funny bags. The engineers described what they thought the machine was. They were bummed it was destroyed, but understood why it had to be done. At some point in the middle of the night, the second security team calmed in and landed. They were official federal-level law enforcement and didn't say much, but didn't seem like bad people. They had a meeting in the conference room and thanked the contract team for their service, but explained the mission had changed. The storm had hit full blast, and civil unrest had reached critical levels. The separatists hit every single major city along the I-5 belt at exactly the same time. They were using black bloc tactics, but expected to be rolling in with a main uniformed force to save the cities by morning. Orders from high up were to get all the conservative officials out of the cities and pull all the funding and let them have their precious city-states. There was one catch: they could have all of this, but they couldn't have electricity. Everyone in the room chuckled. The chief of the new security team asked, "I assume this isn't going to be a problem for anyone." Doug and all the contractors didn't care one way or the other. They only do what they're told. The engineers asked if they at least got to stay and keep the dam going. The security chief asked that they absolutely please stay, but that they wouldn't be prisoners. Their families could come live up here if they could get here, whatever they wanted. Everyone was happy. Everyone got what they wanted, and everyone shook hands. Doug and his team grabbed their gear and got on the new helicopter with the new helicopter pilot that totally wasn't going to die. Doug looked back for a second to see an additional helicopter land with crates of gear. As the chopper pulled up, he saw them open one of the crates to have an M249 with a huge stationary mount poking out of the box next to it with thousands of rounds of ammo, and a laser-guided targeting with the friend or foe system on board. At least being American-made, he didn't have to worry about it shooting him out of the air like a certain notorious Russian missile system. Cough, cough. Doug mentally shrugged to himself as they choppered off into the night. Mission successful. Chapter 23, Doug, Flight Home, Later Night, Day 2. They got about halfway home by Doug's measurements. 1 second it was a normal-looking nightscape, and then as everyone was sleeping and as far as Doug could see in every direction, the lights started shutting off grid by grid. Nobody said anything on the helicopter. They landed also without a word back where they'd started. Only about half got off, including Doug and Challenger, and then the helicopter took off to another spot in the darkness. Doug could hear the sirens off in the distance. Challenger walked around to sniff. The snow had melted a bit, and Doug could smell salt in the air. It was colder because of the wind, but he could tell it was about to thaw out when the sun rose and the warmer air blew in as the storm moved inland. Chapter 24, Doug, Getting Home, Later Night, Day 2. The storm would widen and then weaken. Everything would be rainy mush in half a day. It'd be just in time for the city trucks to come out and act like they did something, but in reality, it'd be 2 days late as always. It was like they had a silent agreement with the tow truck companies and insurance companies to backdoor tax the living crap out of all the idiots that would go driving. Another idiot tax. Doug thought about it, though, and this would be the last of the idiot taxes for a long while. He walked to his truck, opened the passenger door, and Challenger sauntered over and hopped in. They drove home and turned the radio on. The news was broadcasting on emergency power and assured everyone it was a temporary blackout, but Doug obviously knew otherwise. He pulled up to the house, and there was a big chest waiting on the front door that was heavy as all get out. He let Challenger out to go potty and scout, and then loaded the chest into the back of his truck without even looking at it. He felt like it weighed well over 100 pounds, which made it interesting in the snow. He dragged it and then pivoted it into the back end. Challenger ran around and sniffed in the yard, and Doug went inside to get a few things. He brought out 2 bags and threw them in the back of the truck and went back inside. Challenger sat down and watched Doug walk back and forth doing this. Doug got out 2 more big bags and threw them in the back of the truck. Challenger watched, not really thinking anything of it. Doug came back out with 2 giant 40-pound bags of dog food and finally threw those in. That definitely got Challenger's attention. Doug looked in the back of the truck and it was full, so he closed it quietly as to not wake the oblivious neighbors sleeping naively in their warm homes. Doug went back in and got a few more hard cases. Those went in the back seat and then shoved in the back and stuffed them down on top so he could see out his rear view. He locked the house a final time. There was no point in messing with the porch light. The passenger door was still open. He patted on the seat and in leapt Challenger, ready to go. Doug drove over the hill about 20 yards and radioed his buddy. "You got pants on?" He waited a few seconds and then calmed back. "No." Doug responded, "Okay, see you in a few minutes." There was a pause, then he got a copy back. Off Doug and Challenger drove. Chapter 25, Doug, Epilogue, Pre-Dawn, Day 3. Doug caught up with his buddy that was working at the AK lab and told him everything that was going on. His friend was skeptical despite all the other clues until Doug pulled out one of the printed AKs that he'd swiped from the dam and held it out for display. His friend was an AK expert and examined the rifle and agreed with the conclusion. It had all the special markings of the AKs that the Separatists had been mass-producing for their army. "Well, I guess this is war then," Doug's friend said. Doug nodded grimly. More of their friends were starting to arrive to consolidate their resources in a central location as the sun came up. With the last to arrive, they quickly got caught up on the situation when a weird radio call came in. "I am the old recycling plant, being attacked. Mob. I'm at recycling plant. Mob, all in black. Recycling center. Please help. Trapped." They all looked at each other. That's where they all used to work before it got shut down. Doug's watch flashed with a simple message. Recyclery. Critical asset. It was time to go save the recycling plant and investigate whoever was radioing from there. Chapter 26. End of story time. Classroom stronghold. 3 years after the collapse. Late winter, early spring. "So you see, class, that's how I got rescued and how the power was out and everything." They all looked at each other and shrugged. I continued, "Come on, it had fire and cold and a wolf. What else could you possibly want?" One of the smart alecks responded, "It didn't have a train or a flood." The rest of the kids laughed. I thought for a second and responded, "There never was a flood, though, and the trains still aren't working." We're working on getting that one working, though. I'll tell you about it tomorrow. Also, the last flood was like 12 years ago. We're really overdue. It's been a cold winter. And if we have a wet, rainy spring, it could flood in the lower areas pretty easily, but don't worry. It can't flood here. We're up way too high and nowhere near an old riverbed or anything. That seemed to make them all happy, and it was time for the parents to start picking up the kids. They'll had started bundling up and thanked me for being their teacher and for the stories. I told them all I'd see them tomorrow, and thanks for being such awesome kids. One such awesome kid stopped and asked me a final question. "So, Doug has a dog at the end, but he's supposed to save you at the beginning. I don't remember a dog at the beginning." I thought for a second, not really having a good answer. I assumed that they stopped somewhere for a minute first, and he temporarily dropped the dog off. That way it wouldn't mess with the cat in case the cat was there. They were also driving different vehicles when they came to save me. I honestly have no idea. I never thought to ask. She thought for a second. That seemed like a good enough reason, so she got ready to go without any more inquiry about the story. Within a half an hour, all the kids got picked up, and it was time for me to go back to my tiny home and go back to bed. I was starting to see spots as my headache got worse, and I barely made it inside before the black spots got worse. My cat had enough food and water, and I had to lay down quick before I got too dizzy, my heart rate picking up despite not having exerted myself at all. I shut and locked the door and slumped into bed, laying my AR next to me and getting about half my gear off before having to close my eyes. My cat jumped up, meowed at me a few times, then lay down on top of me, facing away, staring at the door. That's all I remember before everything silently and peacefully went to black. So that is the end of book number 8. Books 1 through 8 complete volume 1. So that is the end of volume 1. Volume 2 picks up with antivirus, and there won't be any teaser for it, so you'll just have to stay tuned, because the rest of the books don't have teasers at the end. Only the first volume does. So thank you for reading, and don't forget, or listening, and don't forget to please share with your friends, because it helps me out a lot. Thank you, and goodbye. Stay safe.